Hello there, and welcome to the Slumber Science Society. Perhaps you've had a long day, or maybe you just like falling asleep while thinking about history's mysteries. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter as gravity itself seems to ease its grip. Tonight we drift into a darker chapter of human history, into the shadow of the Black Death, the plague that reshaped medieval Europe and changed the course of civilization itself. A time when death arrived without warning, when cities fell silent, and when the world seemed to be ending. The Black Death holds countless stories, each one revealing something about human resilience, suffering, and the fragile nature of life. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin. The world before the plague was a different place entirely. In the early 1300s, Europe was emerging from centuries of slow growth. The climate had been favorable for decades, what historians call the medieval warm period, and populations had swelled to heights not seen since the Roman Empire. Towns and cities buzzed with activity. Markets overflowed with goods from distant lands. Fields stretched endlessly across the countryside, cultivated by millions of peasant families who worked the soil from dawn until dusk. This was a world of stark contrasts. Magnificent cathedrals rose toward the heavens in cities like Paris, Florence, and London, their spires testament to human ambition and divine devotion. Yet in the shadows of these architectural marvels, the poor huddled in cramped quarters, living in conditions we would find unimaginable today. The streets were narrow, often unpaved, lined with timber-framed buildings that leaned precariously over muddy lanes. Waste flowed openly through gutters when it flowed at all. Animals shared living spaces with families. The scent of smoke, sewage, and unwashed bodies mingled in the air. Medieval society operated on a rigid feudal system. At the top sat kings and nobles, who controlled vast estates and wielded absolute power over their subjects. Below them, knights provided military service in exchange for land. Then came the merchants and craftsmen of the growing towns, organized into guilds that regulated their trades with iron discipline. At the bottom, making up perhaps 90% of the population, were the peasants. These were the serfs and tenant farmers bound to the land, obligated to work their lord's fields, restricted in their movements, and taxed on nearly everything they produced. Life expectancy hovered around 30 years, though this number is somewhat misleading. Childhood was perilous. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday, victims of disease, malnutrition, or accident. Those who survived childhood might live into their 50s or even 60s, but life remained hard and unforgiving at every turn. People worked from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Food, while sometimes abundant after good harvests, was monotonous. Bread and porridge formed the foundation of most meals. Meat was a luxury for special occasions. Fresh vegetables in winter were almost unknown. The church dominated every aspect of existence. Its calendar structured the year with feast days and fasts. Its teachings shaped how people understood the world, their place in it, and what awaited them after death. Priests and monks were among the few literate members of society. They recorded events, maintained what learning existed, and served as intermediaries between God and humanity. The church was also enormously wealthy, controlling perhaps 1/3 of all land in Europe, and its authority went largely unquestioned. To defy the church was to risk one's immortal soul. Yet beneath this stable surface, tensions were mounting. The population had grown so large that it was pressing against the limits of medieval agricultural technology. By the early 1300s, farmers were cultivating marginal lands that yielded poor harvests. Forests that had stood for millennia were cleared for fields. Even with all this expansion, food production struggled to keep pace with the number of mouths to feed. Then the climate began to shift. The medieval warm period was giving way to what would be called the Little Ice Age. Between 1315 and 1322, a series of catastrophic harvests struck northern Europe. Incessant rains rotted crops in the fields. The Great Famine, as it came to be known, killed perhaps 10% of the population. People ate bark, grass, and things that ordinarily they would not touch. Stories circulated of desperate acts, of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed, of the sick and elderly left to die so that the young might survive. The famine eventually eased, but it left the population weakened, malnourished, and vulnerable. Into this world of crowded cities, limited sanitation, and precarious existence, a disease was about to arrive that would make the Great Famine seem like a mere prelude to apocalypse. But the plague did not originate in Europe. Its story begins far to the east, in the vast grasslands and mountains of Central Asia, in regions that were part of the Great Mongol Empire. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century had created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. From the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe, from Siberia to Persia, Mongol horsemen had swept across the continent, destroying kingdoms and establishing a new order. In their wake came something unexpected, an unprecedented network of trade routes. The Mongol Peace, or Pax Mongolica, made it safer to travel across Asia than it had been for centuries. Merchants moved freely under Mongol protection, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas between East and West. The pathways of commerce became the pathways of disease. The bacterium that would devastate Europe likely existed in the arid plateaus of Central Asia for thousands of years, circulating quietly among populations of wild rodents. These animals, primarily marmots and gerbils, served as natural reservoirs for the disease. Living in their burrows, these rodents harbored fleas, and the fleas carried within their bodies a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The details of how this ancient infection transitioned from rodent populations to humans remain partly mysterious. Climate fluctuations may have played a role. A period of warmth and moisture could have caused rodent populations to explode, spreading into new territories. Then, as conditions changed again, the rodents died off in massive numbers, forcing their fleas to seek new hosts. Humans, living in close proximity to these animals, provided ready alternatives. Some historians point to warfare in the region. The Mongol Empire, having reached its greatest extent, was fragmenting into rival khanates by the 1330s. Military campaigns disrupted ecosystems, displaced human and animal populations alike, and created the perfect conditions for disease to jump species. Other scholars emphasize trade. Caravans traveling the Silk Road stopped at caravanserais, the fortified inns that dotted the route. At these gathering places, merchants from different regions mingled. Their goods and their baggage inevitably included rats and fleas that had stowed away for the journey. The earliest reliable reports of the plague come from China in the 1330s. Chronicles mention a pestilence in Hubei province around 1334 that may have killed millions, though the details remain vague and debated. What is clearer is that by the early 1340s, the disease was spreading westward along the trade routes, following the very roads that had brought prosperity and connection between civilizations. As the plague moved west, it found perfect conditions in the towns and cities along the Silk Road. These were cosmopolitan places where merchants from China, Persia, the Middle East, and Europe conducted business. Living conditions were crowded, sanitation was primitive even by medieval standards, and rats thrived in the grain stores that supplied these trading communities. The disease moved from town to town, city to city, leaving death and devastation in its wake. One of the most pivotal moments in the plague's journey westward occurred at a city called Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula on the northern shore of the Black Sea. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony, one of several that the Italian city-state of Genoa had established along the Black Sea coast. These colonies were immensely valuable, serving as the western terminus of the Silk Road, where goods from China and Central Asia were loaded onto ships bound for Mediterranean ports. In 1346, the Mongol Khan Janibeg laid siege to Kaffa. The reasons for the siege were complex, involving commercial disputes and the growing tensions between the Mongols and the Italian merchants who controlled so much of the Black Sea trade. The siege dragged on for months, with the Genoese defenders safe behind their formidable walls while the Mongol army encamped outside. Then something terrible happened. Plague broke out in the Mongol camp. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The siege became untenable as Janibeg's army disintegrated from disease. But before the Mongols withdrew, they attempted one final, desperate act. According to the account of an Italian notary named Gabriel de Mussis, who may or may not have been present, the Mongols used trebuchets, large siege catapults, to hurl the corpses of plague victims over the walls into the city. Whether this actually happened remains debated by historians. De Mussis was not necessarily an eyewitness, and his account has elements that seem designed to horrify his audience. But whether or not the Mongols deliberately spread the disease, the plague certainly reached Kaffa. And when Genoese merchants fled the doomed city, they carried the infection with them aboard their ships. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The ships had sailed from Kaffa, stopping at Constantinople and other ports along the way. When they docked at Messina, the authorities who came aboard found a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors were dead, their bodies covered in hideous black swellings. Those still alive were clearly dying, groaning in agony, their skin marked by the same dreadful boils that wept blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was too late. The disease had already come ashore. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill. Within weeks, the city was in the grip of full-blown epidemic. The disease that had crossed thousands of miles of steppe and mountain, that had traveled the Silk Road and sailed the Black Sea, had finally reached Europe. The disease itself was unlike anything Europeans had ever experienced. It struck with terrifying speed and seemingly without pattern. A person who was healthy in the morning could be dead by nightfall. The symptoms were grotesque and unmistakable. Most victims developed swellings, called buboes, in their groin, armpits, or neck. These lumps, sometimes as large as apples, were intensely painful and filled with blood and pus. When they burst, the stench was overwhelming. Fever came next, often soaring so high that victims became delirious. They screamed, hallucinated, and thrashed in their beds. Some fell into stupors and never woke. Their skin became covered in dark blotches, purplish-black spots that gave the disease one of its names, the Black Death. These marks were signs of internal bleeding and tissue death. The body was quite literally dying from within. There were actually 3 forms of the plague, though medieval people did not understand the distinctions. The most common was bubonic plague, characterized by those dreadful swellings. This form spread primarily through flea bites. Infected fleas, gorged on the blood of diseased rats, would bite humans and regurgitate the bacteria into the wound. The bacteria traveled through the lymphatic system to the nearest lymph node, where they multiplied rapidly, causing the swelling and pain. The second form was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. Victims coughed up blood, struggled to breathe, and often died even faster than those with bubonic plague, sometimes within a day of showing symptoms. Pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person through airborne droplets when an infected person coughed or sneezed. This made it even more terrifying and harder to avoid. The third and rarest form was septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. This form killed so quickly that victims sometimes died before developing buboes or respiratory symptoms. Their skin would turn dark purple or black from hemorrhaging under the skin, and they would succumb within hours. The mortality rate was staggering. For bubonic plague, perhaps 50 to 60% of those infected died. For pneumonic plague, the death rate approached 95% or higher. There was no effective treatment, no way to cure the disease or even substantially ease its symptoms. Medieval physicians were completely baffled. They had no understanding of bacteria, no concept of infection in the modern sense, and no tools that could stop the disease's progress. People tried everything. They purged their bowels with powerful laxatives, believing the disease was caused by corrupt humors that needed to be expelled. They bled themselves or had barbers let their blood, following the ancient theory that disease resulted from imbalances in the body's fluids. Some covered the buboes with poultices of herbs, animal fat, or human excrement. Others wore amulets, recited prayers, or consulted astrologers to determine favorable times for treatments. Nothing worked. The plague killed rich and poor, young and old, pious and sinful without distinction. It spared no one. And once it arrived in Messina in October 1347, it began its inexorable march across Europe. From Sicily, the disease spread with horrifying speed. Ships carried it to other Mediterranean ports. By December 1347, it had reached Marseilles in southern France and Genoa in northern Italy. Merchants fleeing the infected cities unknowingly carried the disease inland. Travelers on the roads, seeking to escape the plague, instead spread it to new regions. Pilgrims heading to holy shrines brought the infection to monasteries and religious sites. Throughout 1348, the Black Death swept across southern Europe like a terrible wave. In Italy, cities fell one after another. Pisa, Venice, Florence, Rome, all succumbed. The Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, left one of the most vivid eyewitness accounts. He described how the disease struck so suddenly that people healthy at breakfast were dead by evening. He wrote of the strange black swellings, the fevers, the vomiting of blood. He noted how the mere touch of a sick person's clothing seemed sufficient to transmit the disease to the healthy. Florence was a wealthy city, perhaps the richest in Europe, yet its prosperity meant nothing against the plague. Boccaccio estimated that 100,000 people died in the city, though modern historians think the number was closer to 50,000, still an enormous proportion of the population. Entire families were wiped out. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The social fabric of the city unraveled as people abandoned their duties, their neighbors, even their own relatives. France suffered terribly. The disease entered through Marseilles in early 1348 and spread north along the Rhône Valley. By spring, it had reached Avignon, where the papal court was located. Pope Clement VI watched helplessly as cardinals, bishops, and thousands of ordinary faithful died around him. The Pope himself survived, possibly because his physicians advised him to sit between two large fires, which may have helped to keep infected fleas at bay, though no one at the time understood why this might work. Paris, the largest city in Europe with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, fell to the plague in summer 1348. The death toll was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that between 1/3 and half the city's population died in the first wave of the plague. The graveyards overflowed. Mass burial pits were dug, but even these proved insufficient. At the cemetery of the Holy Innocents, workers excavated enormous trenches where thousands of corpses were laid in layers, covered with a thin layer of earth, only to have more bodies added the next day. England's turn came in autumn 1348. The plague likely arrived through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, brought by a ship from Gascony. From there, it spread along the southern coast. Bristol, one of England's major ports, was devastated. By winter, the disease had reached London. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote that in the parish of St. Mary's alone, more than 200 bodies were buried in a single cemetery that had been consecrated specifically for plague victims. Edward III, King of England, saw his own family touched by the plague. His daughter Joan was traveling to Spain to marry the son of King Alfonso of Castile when she contracted the disease in Bordeaux. She died in September 1348, and with her died the hopes for a political alliance that might have changed European history. The plague did not stop at England's borders. It crossed the Irish Sea and devastated Ireland. It spread north into Scotland, where the Scots reportedly called it the foul death of the English, at least until it killed them too. By 1349, it had reached Scandinavia. Ships carried it to Bergen in Norway, and from there it spread along the coast. Sweden and Denmark fell victim. Even remote Iceland, days of sailing from the nearest land, was not spared. In every place it touched, the story was similar. First came rumors, terrifying reports from neighboring regions. Then came the fear, palpable and growing as the disease drew nearer. Then the plague itself arrived, and with it came death on a scale that defied comprehension. Cities lost half their populations. Villages were depopulated entirely, their houses empty, their fields overgrown, their church bells silent. The plague's progress across Europe followed the patterns of medieval trade and travel, but it also revealed the interconnectedness of European society. No region was isolated enough to escape. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, refugees, all carried the disease with them. The very networks that had brought prosperity and growth to medieval Europe now became conduits for death. Eastern Europe did not escape. The plague reached Poland and Russia in 1349 and 1350. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia all suffered outbreaks. The disease crossed the Alps into the Holy Roman Empire, striking German cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg. Strasbourg, a major commercial center, experienced one of the worst outbreaks, with thousands dying in the summer of 1349. By 1350, the initial wave of the plague was beginning to subside in Western Europe, though sporadic outbreaks continued. The disease had traveled from the steppes of Central Asia to the Atlantic coast of Europe in less than a decade. It had crossed thousands of miles, adapting to every climate and geography, finding victims in every city, town, and village it encountered. The impact on the population was staggering. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that Europe lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population to the Black Death. This meant that 25 to 30 million people died out of a pre-plague population of perhaps 75 to 80 million. To put this in perspective, it would be as if a disease killed over 2 billion people today. No war, no natural disaster, no previous epidemic had ever killed on such a scale. The death toll varied by region. Some areas were hit harder than others. Cities generally suffered more than the countryside, though no place was safe. Italy and France may have lost half their populations. England lost between 1/3 and 40%. Iberia, Poland, and parts of Germany suffered somewhat less, though the death toll was still horrific. Some remote or isolated regions escaped relatively lightly, but these were exceptions. The speed of death was as shocking as its scale. In cities, hundreds or thousands could die in a single day at the peak of an outbreak. Boccaccio wrote that in Florence, so many were dying that there was not enough consecrated ground to bury them all. Bodies were stacked in layers in hastily dug pits. Some were thrown into rivers. Others were simply abandoned where they died, left to rot in streets and houses. The social impact was immediate and devastating. As the plague spread, normal life collapsed. Markets closed. Craftsmen stopped working. Schools shut their doors. Courts ceased to function. The machinery of government ground to a halt as officials fled or died. In some cities, so many clergy died that there were not enough priests to perform burial rites or hear confessions. The sacraments, so central to medieval Catholic life, became difficult or impossible to obtain. Fear dominated everything. People became paranoid, suspicious of anyone showing the slightest symptom. Families abandoned their sick relatives, leaving them to die alone rather than risk infection. Parents deserted children, and children fled from parents. The sick were often locked in their houses, condemned to die of disease, hunger, or thirst. Some were nailed into their homes to prevent them from spreading the contagion. Boccaccio described how the bonds of love and duty dissolved in the face of the plague. He wrote of servants who would no longer tend their masters, of children who refused to care for dying parents. He noted how rare it was to find anyone willing to wash and prepare a corpse for burial, a duty normally sacred and expected. Instead, bodies were dragged from houses and left in the street for carts to collect. The breakdown of social order took many forms. In some places, crime soared as law enforcement collapsed. People looted empty houses, stole from the dead, and attacked anyone they thought might be carrying the disease. In other places, a desperate hedonism took hold. Knowing they might die tomorrow, people abandoned moral restraints. They drank, gambled, and sought pleasure with frantic intensity. Boccaccio wrote of groups who shut themselves in houses with plenty of food and wine, refusing to think about death, while others roamed the streets in drunken revelry. Yet alongside the fear and selfishness, there were also acts of courage and compassion. Some physicians stayed at their posts, treating the sick even though they knew it meant almost certain death. Priests heard confessions and administered last rites, knowing they were exposing themselves to infection. Monks and nuns in monasteries tended to the afflicted, with entire communities sometimes dying in service to others. Religious houses were hit particularly hard. Monasteries and convents, with their enclosed communities and close living quarters, proved perfect breeding grounds for the disease. In some places, entire monasteries were wiped out. The Blackfriars in London lost 2/3 of their members. At the Abbey of Mow in Yorkshire, the abbot and many of his monks died, leaving the monastery barely functioning. The loss of so many trained religious professionals would have lasting consequences for the church and for learning in Europe. Daily life during the plague was suffused with death and the fear of death. The morning might bring news that a neighbor had died in the night. The afternoon might see a funeral procession, if anyone could be found to organize one, though often bodies were simply taken away in carts, dumped in pits, and covered over. Evening came with prayers and the desperate hope that morning would find you still alive and uninfected. People tried to understand why this was happening. Why was God allowing such suffering? What had humanity done to deserve this punishment? These questions tormented the medieval mind. The prevailing explanation was that the plague was divine judgment for sin. Humanity had become too worldly, too proud, too sinful. God was using the plague to punish the wicked and test the faithful. This interpretation led to various responses. Some people became more devout, spending hours in prayer, attending Mass, making pilgrimages to holy shrines. They hoped that piety and penitence would protect them or at least ensure their salvation if they died. Others turned to more extreme forms of religious expression, including the flagellants, groups of men who wandered from town to town whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. The flagellant movement began in Central Europe and spread quickly. These groups, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would enter a town and process to the main square. There, stripped to the waist, they would beat themselves with leather scourges embedded with sharp pieces of metal. They sang hymns and chanted prayers while blood ran down their backs. They claimed that by suffering voluntarily, they were imitating Christ's passion and appeasing God's wrath. For a time, the flagellants were welcomed in many places. People saw them as holy men whose sufferings might persuade God to end the plague. But the movement soon became problematic. The flagellants began to claim authority independent of the Church. They preached that their rituals were more effective than the sacraments. They attacked Jews and other groups they considered sinful. The Pope eventually condemned the movement in 1349, but not before it had contributed to violence and instability across Europe. The search for scapegoats was inevitable. When faced with catastrophe beyond understanding or control, humans often look for someone to blame. In the case of the Black Death, Jews became the primary targets. Across Europe, Jewish communities were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells, a baseless charge that nonetheless gained widespread belief. The violence began in southern France in spring 1348 and spread rapidly. In Toulon, the Jewish quarter was attacked and 40 Jews were murdered. In Barcelona, the Jewish community was assaulted. But the worst violence occurred in the German lands in 1348 and 1349. In Strasbourg, despite the city council's initial attempts to protect them, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the Jewish cemetery on Valentine's Day 1349. In Mainz, Frankfurt, and dozens of other cities, Jewish communities were destroyed. Sometimes the violence happened before the plague even arrived. In Strasbourg, the slaughter occurred months before the disease reached the city, as if killing Jews might prevent the plague from coming. In other places, Jews were rounded up, tortured until they confessed to poisoning wells, and then burned. Entire communities vanished. The 1,000-year history of Jewish life in many German cities was obliterated in a few months of murderous fury. The Pope and some secular authorities tried to protect Jews, pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague just like Christians, which proved they were not responsible. But these appeals often went unheeded. The combination of religious prejudice, economic resentment, many Jews worked as moneylenders and were owed debts that would be cancelled if they were killed, and the desperate need to find an explanation for the catastrophe all contributed to the violence. For those who survived, daily existence continued in the shadow of death. Agricultural labor became crucial as so many workers died. The harvest could not be abandoned, even with plague raging, or there would be starvation in addition to disease. In the fields, peasants worked alongside corpses that no one had time to bury. They tied cloth over their faces, more from the stench than any real understanding of contagion, and tried to bring in the crops before they themselves fell ill. In cities, essential services struggled to continue. Bakers still baked bread, though perhaps half their neighbors were dead. Blacksmiths repaired tools and shod horses. Grocers sold what food was available. But many professions simply ceased. Who needed a tailor when they might die before the garment was finished? Who commissioned artwork or jewelry when tomorrow was uncertain? The economy lurched and stumbled. Trade collapsed as merchants fled infected cities or died. Ships sat idle in harbors. Goods rotted in warehouses. Prices fluctuated wildly. In some places, food became scarce and expensive as farmers died before harvest. In other places, so much property changed hands through death that some commodities became temporarily cheap as estates were liquidated. Money itself became suspect. Coins might be contaminated, people thought. Some refused to touch money that had passed through many hands. Others tried to clean coins with vinegar or heated them in fire. Trade increasingly relied on barter rather than currency, at least in the short term. The financial networks that connected medieval Europe were severely disrupted, and it would take years for them to recover. The psychological impact of living through the Black Death cannot be overstated. Imagine a world where perhaps half the people you knew died within a year. Your spouse, your children, your parents, your friends, your neighbors. Entire streets emptied. Churches that once overflowed now echoed with the prayers of a handful of survivors. The social landscape you had known your entire life was transformed into something alien and frightening. Survivors faced not only grief but also guilt. Why had they lived when others died? There seemed to be no pattern, no logic to who survived and who perished. The young and healthy died while some elderly and frail survived. The pious perished while the sinful lived. This randomness challenged medieval understanding of divine justice and raised disturbing questions about God's plan. For children who survived, the trauma was especially deep. Many were orphaned, their parents, siblings, and extended family all dead. These children often ended up in monasteries or convents, if there was room, or were taken in by surviving relatives if any existed. Some simply wandered, joining the bands of homeless that grew larger as the plague progressed. The emptiness was profound. In the countryside, entire villages stood abandoned. Houses with their doors left open, gardens overgrown, domestic animals roaming wild or dead in their pens. The silence was eerie, broken only by the wind and perhaps the cawing of crows feeding on the unburied dead. These ghost villages, some of which would never be resettled, dotted the landscape of post-plague Europe. In cities, neighborhoods that had teemed with life became almost deserted. Survivors clustered together, seeking comfort in community, but vast sections of urban areas sat empty. Property values plummeted. Houses, shops, and warehouses could be had for a fraction of their former price, if anyone wanted them. Who wanted to move into a house where an entire family had died of plague? The dead haunted the living, not as literal ghosts, though there were plenty of such stories, but through the sheer weight of loss and absence. Survivors missed the people they had loved. They missed the world that had existed before the plague, a world that now seemed impossibly distant and forever lost. The certainties of medieval life, the sense that tomorrow would be like yesterday, that the order of things was stable and would endure, all this had been shattered. Yet humanity is resilient. Even as the plague raged, life struggled to continue. Babies were born, couples married, fields were planted. In the midst of death, people still sought moments of normalcy, of hope, of connection with one another. This resilience, this refusal to simply surrender to despair, would prove crucial in the years to come as Europe began the long, slow process of recovery and rebuilding. The spread of the plague across specific regions reveals the intricate patterns of medieval life and commerce. Take Spain, for instance. The disease entered through Mediterranean ports in 1348. Barcelona, one of the great commercial centers of the Western Mediterranean, was struck in May of that year. The city's merchants had extensive trading connections with Italy and southern France, And these same networks that brought prosperity also brought death. From Barcelona, the plague spread along the coast and inland. Valencia, Majorca, and the Balearic Islands all experienced devastating outbreaks. The Kingdom of Aragon saw its population decline by perhaps 40%. In Catalonia, the mortality was even higher in some areas. The disease moved more slowly in the interior of Iberia, partly because these regions were less densely populated and less connected to major trade routes. Castile, the largest kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, was not spared. The plague entered through ports on the Bay of Biscay and spread south. King Alfonso XI of Castile was leading a siege against the Muslim-held city of Gibraltar when plague broke out in his army. In March 1350, the king himself fell ill and died, demonstrating that not even royal blood provided protection. His death sent shockwaves through the Spanish kingdoms and disrupted military campaigns that had been part of the ongoing Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. Portugal, on the western edge of Europe, experienced its first outbreaks in 1348 as well. Ships from infected ports brought the disease to Lisbon, Porto, and other coastal cities. From there, it spread inland, though some mountainous regions and remote villages were temporarily spared. The overall mortality in Portugal was comparable to other parts of southern Europe, perhaps 1/3 of the population perishing. The German lands, fragmented into hundreds of principalities, free cities, and ecclesiastical territories, experienced the plague in waves during 1349 and 1350. The disease followed the Rhine and Danube rivers, those ancient highways of commerce and communication. Cities like Cologne, Strasbourg, and Nuremberg suffered terribly. In many German cities, the mortality rate exceeded 50%. Frankfurt lost perhaps 2/3 of its population. The impact on the Holy Roman Empire was particularly complex because of its political fragmentation. Each prince, bishop, or city council responded differently to the crisis. Some authorities tried to impose quarantines, forbidding travelers from entering their territories. Others welcomed refugees, only to find they had admitted the disease. Communication between territories was slow and unreliable, making coordinated responses impossible. In the Low Countries, what would later become Belgium and the Netherlands, the plague arrived in 1349. The great trading cities of Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp saw their populations decimated. These cities, grown wealthy on the wool trade and textile manufacturing, found their economies paralyzed. Workers died faster than they could be replaced. Workshops closed. Ships sat idle in the harbors of Bruges and other ports. The sophisticated networks of trade and finance that had made the Low Countries so prosperous were severely disrupted. Switzerland, with its mountainous terrain, might have hoped for protection, but the plague crossed even the Alps. The disease spread along the trade routes that connected Italian cities with northern Europe, following the passes through the mountains. Basel, Zurich, and Geneva all experienced outbreaks. Mountain villages, normally isolated, found that isolation was no guarantee of safety when infected travelers brought the disease to their remote valleys. The Baltic region and Scandinavia experienced the plague's northern reach. In Sweden, the disease struck in 1350. King Magnus II tried to impose quarantine measures, but these were largely ineffective. The plague spread through the Swedish countryside, devastating both rural and urban populations. Norway, with its long coastline and numerous ports, was hit hard. The mortality there may have been as high as 60% in some regions, one of the highest rates in Europe. Denmark saw similar devastation. The island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, home to the wealthy trading city of Visby, experienced a catastrophic outbreak. Archaeological evidence from mass graves in Visby provides chilling testimony to the scale of death. Hundreds of skeletons, many still wearing their clothes and jewelry, were buried hastily in large pits. The remains show signs of the hasty, mass burials typical of plague outbreaks. Even remote Iceland, far out in the North Atlantic, was not spared, though it came later. Ships from Norway brought the plague to Iceland in 1402 and again in 1495. These later outbreaks, part of the plague's recurring waves in subsequent centuries, killed substantial portions of Iceland's small population and disrupted the already fragile economy of this isolated island. The spread to Eastern Europe followed similar patterns but with some variations. Poland experienced the plague in 1349, though some historians argue that the death toll was lower than in Western Europe. King Casimir III took measures to protect his kingdom, including offering refuge to Jews fleeing persecution in German lands. Whether through his policies, geographical factors, or simple chance, Poland seems to have suffered somewhat less than many other regions. Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, was struck in 1349 and 1350. Prague, one of the great cities of Central Europe and seat of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, saw significant mortality. The emperor, who would later found Charles University in Prague, witnessed the plague's devastation firsthand, and it influenced his later policies and his support for public health measures. Hungary experienced multiple waves of plague starting in 1349. The Kingdom of Hungary at this time included territories that are now part of Slovakia, Croatia, and Romania. The disease spread along the Danube and through the Carpathian Basin. Hungarian chronicles record the terror and confusion as the Great Mortality swept through towns and villages. Monasteries kept records of the dead, and these documents reveal that mortality rates varied widely, from 25% in some areas to over 60% in others. Russia and the Eastern Slavic lands saw the plague in 1350 and subsequent years. Novgorod, Pskov, and Moscow all experienced outbreaks. The impact on these regions is less well documented than in Western Europe, but Russian chronicles mention the Black Death and describe symptoms consistent with plague. The mortality was significant enough to disrupt trade, agriculture, and the constant conflicts between Russian principalities. The Balkans, then partly under Byzantine control and partly under various Serbian and Bulgarian rulers, experienced the plague as it spread from Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of conflict and territorial loss, was further devastated. Constantinople itself had been struck in 1347, and the disease spread through the empire's remaining territories. The mortality added to the empire's woes and contributed to its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Ottoman Empire, rising in Anatolia, was not immune to the plague either. Turkish sources mention devastating outbreaks in the mid-14th century. The disease complicated Ottoman military campaigns and affected the empire's expansion, though it also hit the Ottomans' enemies just as hard, creating a kind of terrible equilibrium. The Middle East and North Africa, regions from which the plague had entered Europe, continued to suffer recurring outbreaks. Egypt, Syria, and Palestine experienced catastrophic mortality. The Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt and Syria, saw its population decline sharply. Contemporary Arab historians like Ibn Khaldun wrote about the plague's impact, describing how it depopulated cities and destroyed the social order. Ibn Khaldun even lost his parents to the plague when it struck Tunis in 1348. The disease affected Islamic regions differently in some respects from Christian Europe. Islamic theology interpreted the plague as a mercy from God for believers, who would be martyrs if they died of the disease, and as a punishment for non-believers. This interpretation discouraged flight, as leaving a plague-stricken area might be seen as fleeing from God's will. At the same time, Islamic medicine, more advanced in some ways than European medicine, attempted various treatments based on Greek and Arabic medical texts. The patterns of plague mortality reveal much about medieval society. Urban areas consistently suffered higher death rates than rural areas. Cities, with their density, their rat populations thriving on stored grain, and their constant flow of travelers and traders, provided perfect conditions for the disease. In major cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Venice, between 40 and 60% of the population died in the first plague wave. Rural mortality was somewhat lower, though still catastrophic. Villages lost perhaps 30 to 45% of their inhabitants on average, though with enormous variation. Some villages were nearly wiped out, while others lost far fewer people. The reasons for these variations are complex and not fully understood. Geographic isolation helped, but it was no guarantee. Wind patterns, rat populations, the timing of harvest seasons, the movement of refugees, all these factors and more influenced which communities suffered most. Monasteries and convents experienced especially high mortality, often losing half or more of their members. Several factors contributed to this. Religious houses were enclosed communities where disease could spread easily. Monks and nuns also served the sick, exposing themselves to infection. Their devotion to caring for the afflicted led many to sacrifice their own lives. The loss of clergy and monks had profound implications. These were the educated elite of medieval society. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, and preserved what learning existed. When entire monasteries were depopulated, irreplaceable books and manuscripts were lost or neglected. The continuity of scholarship was broken. It would take generations to rebuild the intellectual infrastructure of medieval Christendom. Physicians died at higher rates than the general population. Those few who had medical training and stayed to treat patients exposed themselves repeatedly to infection. In cities, the shortage of physicians became critical. Wealthy families who could normally afford the best care found no one available. Even the Pope in Avignon, surrounded by the best physicians money could buy, watched helplessly as people died around him. The speed of death varied in different outbreak locations. In some cities, the plague exploded all at once, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. In others, it smoldered for months, with daily deaths gradually increasing to a peak before declining. The weather played a role. Plague seemed worse in warm weather when flea populations were at their height. Some regions experienced their worst outbreaks in summer, while others peaked in autumn. The rhythm of the plague spread across Europe roughly followed the seasons and the patterns of medieval travel. Ships carried it quickly across the Mediterranean in 1347 and 1348. Then, as winter set in, the disease's spread slowed. It resumed with vigor in spring 1348, spreading inland across France, Italy, and Spain. Summer and autumn of 1348 saw the plague reach England, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany. The next year, 1349, it continued north and east, reaching Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia by 1350. But the plague did not simply pass through and disappear. In many places, it lingered, causing sporadic deaths for months or even years after the initial outbreak. Some cities experienced multiple waves, with the disease seeming to fade only to flare up again. People lived in constant fear, never knowing if the plague had truly gone or was merely dormant, waiting to return. The psychological state of plague survivors is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Modern people, even after the COVID-19 pandemic, have not experienced anything like the Black Death scale and ferocity. Imagine losing half the people in your life over the course of a year. Imagine watching people you love die in agony while being unable to help them. Imagine the guilt of surviving when so many perished, the questioning of why you were spared. Some people responded with renewed religious devotion. They saw their survival as a sign of God's grace and committed themselves to lives of piety and service. Others became fatalistic, feeling that death could come at any moment, so there was no point in planning for the future. Still others reacted with hedonism, seeking pleasure and indulgence while they still lived. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague, captures some of these varied responses through its tales told by young people fleeing Florence. The economic disruptions caused by the plague's first wave were immediate and severe. Labor shortages appeared almost overnight as workers died. Harvests were left ungathered in some regions because there were not enough people to bring in the crops. This caused food shortages that compounded the suffering. Artisans and craftsmen who possessed specialized skills died, and their knowledge often died with them. Apprentices who might have learned these trades perished before completing their training. Property changed hands with bewildering speed. A merchant might die, leaving his wealth to relatives who themselves died before the inheritance could be settled. Then distant cousins or even unrelated people claimed the estate. Courts were overwhelmed with inheritance disputes. In some cases, entire families died with no clear heirs, and their property reverted to local lords or the church. This sudden redistribution of wealth had far-reaching consequences that would shape Europe's economic and social structure for generations. The plague also disrupted long-distance trade networks. The routes to the east, which had brought the plague to Europe, saw commerce decline sharply. Merchants were afraid to travel. Ships stayed in port. The Silk Road trade decreased as Central Asian populations were devastated. The Italian city-states, whose wealth depended on Eastern trade, suffered economic blows from which some would never fully recover. Banking and credit systems, sophisticated for their time, were severely strained. Prominent banking families saw their fortunes evaporate as debtors died and loans could not be collected. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks of Florence, two of the largest financial institutions in Europe, had already been weakened by English King Edward III's default on loans in 1345. The plague dealt these banks fatal blows, and they collapsed, sending ripples through the European financial system. Agricultural patterns began to shift in the plague's wake. With fewer workers available, marginal lands that had been cultivated during the population boom of the 13th century were abandoned. Fields returned to forest. Villages on poor soils were deserted as survivors moved to better lands now available. This consolidation actually led to improved agricultural efficiency in the long run, as the remaining farmers worked more productive soil, but in the immediate aftermath it meant disruption and uncertainty. Rents and wages, which had been remarkably stable for generations, began to fluctuate. Landlords found they had to compete for fewer workers. Peasants discovered they could demand better terms. The labor shortage was giving the lower classes bargaining power they had never possessed before, though it would take years for this shift to fully manifest. Landlords and nobles tried to resist these changes, clinging to the old feudal arrangements, but economic reality was pushing in new directions. The plague's demographic impact extended beyond simple mortality numbers. The age distribution of survivors affected society in complex ways. The very young and very old seemed somewhat more vulnerable, though plague killed across all age groups. This meant that working-age adults made up a larger proportion of survivors. But it also meant orphans were common, and the elderly often died leaving no direct descendants. Marriage patterns shifted. Young widows and widowers, suddenly single again, often remarried quickly. In a world where everyone expected to marry and where economic survival often required two adults working together, remarriage was practical necessity. The church relaxed some restrictions on remarriage to accommodate the flood of widowed people. Ages at first marriage may have dropped as well, as young people inherited property earlier than they would have in normal times. Birth rates in the immediate aftermath of the plague are difficult to determine with precision, but they likely declined. With so much death and disruption, with families shattered and economic life in chaos, many people delayed having children or were unable to find partners. It would take a generation or more for population growth to resume, and even then Europe's population would not return to its pre-plague levels until the 16th or even 17th century in some regions. The landscape of Europe was transformed. Travelers moving through the countryside in the years after the plague remarked on the emptiness, the abandoned fields, the villages with doors hanging open and no smoke rising from chimneys. Wild animals reclaimed lands that had been cultivated. Wolves, which had been driven back from settled areas, returned. Forests expanded. In some places, nature reasserted itself with surprising speed, covering over the traces of human habitation. Within cities, certain neighborhoods might be completely deserted while others remained inhabited. The housing stock far exceeded the population for decades. This meant lower rents and housing costs, one of the few positive economic effects for survivors. People could afford better accommodations. Families who had crowded into single rooms might take over entire houses. This improvement in living conditions may have contributed to better health and lower mortality in subsequent generations. Public spaces changed too. Cemeteries expanded enormously during the plague. Cities consecrated new burial grounds to handle the masses of dead. Some of these plague cemeteries became important sites, associated with memories of the catastrophe. In Paris, the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents became a famous landmark, its walls later decorated with murals depicting the dance of death, artistic representations of the plague's universality and the equality of all before death. Religious architecture and art began to reflect the plague experience. New churches were sometimes built in thanksgiving for deliverance from the plague or in memory of the dead. Existing churches received new decorations and artworks. The theme of mortality became more prominent in art. Paintings and sculptures depicted death personified, reminding viewers of life's brevity and the need to prepare for eternity. The immediate crisis of the plague's first wave lasted about 4 years in most regions, from 1347 to 1351, though with local variations. By 1352, the disease seemed to be retreating, though it never fully disappeared. Sporadic outbreaks continued, and everyone lived with the fear that the plague might return in full force. As we will see, these fears were entirely justified. The Black Death would return again and again over the following centuries, though never with quite the same devastating impact as its initial assault. For survivors of that first terrible wave, life slowly began to return to a new kind of normal. Fields needed planting. Animals needed tending. Children needed raising. Commerce, essential for society to function, gradually resumed. But the world had changed fundamentally. The certainties of medieval life had been shattered. Old social structures were weakening. New economic realities were emerging. Europe was being remade by the very absence of the millions who had died. Before we move forward to explore the responses and long-term consequences of the plague, it is worth pausing to understand more fully what it was like to experience the disease at a personal level, and how communities struggled to maintain basic functions as death surrounded them. When the plague struck a town or village, it usually followed a pattern. First came the rumors, carried by travelers or traders who had fled from infected areas. These rumors created enormous anxiety. People argued about whether to believe them or dismiss them as exaggerations. Authorities sometimes suppressed information, fearing panic, though this usually only delayed the inevitable. Then came the first cases. Perhaps a merchant who had been traveling fell ill, or a ship docked and sailors began showing symptoms. Initially, there might be only 1 or 2 cases. Physicians were summoned if any were available. They would examine the patient, noting the fever, the swelling, the discoloration. If they had experience with plague, they recognized the symptoms immediately. If not, they might puzzle over the strange disease, trying different treatments. As days passed, more people fell ill. The disease spread through households first, moving from the initial victim to family members. Then neighbors began to sicken. The pace would accelerate. Within a week or 2, dozens might be sick. Within a month, hundreds. The authorities tried to respond. Guards might be posted at the houses of the sick, forbidding anyone to enter or leave. Physicians and priests were ordered to attend the afflicted, though many fled instead. Public spaces emptied. Markets that had teemed with activity stood nearly deserted. People ventured out only when necessary, hurrying through streets, avoiding contact with others. They tied cloths soaked in vinegar or rosewater over their faces, believing these might protect them from the corrupted air they thought carried the disease. Some carried poses of flowers or herbs, sniffing them constantly in the belief that sweet scents would ward off pestilential vapors. Inside homes where the plague had struck, scenes of horror unfolded. A mother watched her children die one by one, powerless to save them. A husband tended his wife as she grew delirious with fever, knowing he would likely be next. The buboes caused such pain that victims could barely move. Some people went mad from the suffering or the fever. They ran through the street screaming, or threw themselves from windows. Others lay in stupors, unresponsive, slowly fading toward death. Medical care, such as it existed, was primitive and often harmful. Physicians believed the disease was caused by corrupted air or miasma. To combat this, they prescribed burning aromatic woods or herbs to purify the air. They recommended consuming vinegar, which was thought to strengthen the body against corruption. Some advised swallowing powders made of ground gemstones or gold, substances believed to have inherent purity. For the buboes themselves, physicians tried various approaches. Some recommended lancing them to let out the corrupt matter, a procedure that was agonizing and often fatal as secondary infections set in. Others applied poultices of strange ingredients, herbs mixed with animal fat, or even human excrement, following ancient texts that claimed feces could draw out poison. Hot irons were sometimes used to cauterize the swellings, causing further torment to already suffering patients. Bloodletting, the go-to treatment for almost any ailment in medieval medicine, was tried extensively. Physicians opened veins and let blood flow, sometimes taking shocking amounts, believing this would restore the balance of humors in the body. Weak patients died from blood loss before the plague could kill them. Enemas and violent purgatives were also common, forcing patients who were already dehydrated and weak to expel what little remained in their bodies. None of it worked. Occasionally someone survived, probably those whose immune systems managed to fight off the infection despite the treatments rather than because of them. But these survivors were rare enough that each recovery was seen as miraculous. Physicians had no understanding of bacteria, no concept that living organisms too small to see might cause disease. Their entire framework for understanding illness was wrong, making effective treatment impossible. As the death toll mounted, practical problems overwhelmed communities. The most pressing was what to do with the bodies. In normal times, burial was a sacred ritual. The body was washed and wrapped in a shroud. A funeral mass was held. The deceased was laid to rest in consecrated ground with prayers said for their soul. Family and friends gathered to mourn. These customs provided comfort and assured the deceased of a proper passage into the afterlife. The plague made such careful observances impossible. There were simply too many dead and too few living to maintain the old customs. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The stench of decomposition filled the air in infected areas. Carts rolled through streets each day, their drivers calling for people to bring out their dead. Bodies were loaded onto these carts, often without ceremony, and taken to burial grounds. At first, individual graves were dug, each body buried separately as tradition required. But as the death toll climbed, this became impractical. Mass graves, long trenches, were excavated. Bodies were laid in rows, dozens together, and covered with earth. Then more bodies would be added. These plague pits, as they came to be called, sometimes held thousands of corpses. Archaeologists have discovered them under modern cities, grim reminders of the plague's toll. The shortage of priests meant many died without last rites, a source of enormous distress in an age when the Church taught that confession and final blessings were essential for salvation. Families begged priests to attend their dying relatives, but in many places there were not enough clergy to go around. Some priests charged exorbitant fees, taking advantage of people's desperation. Others stayed true to their calling and ministered to the dying until they themselves fell ill. The breakdown of social bonds was perhaps most evident in how people treated each other. The sick were often abandoned. Servants fled from masters. Landlords left tenants to die alone. Even parents sometimes deserted their own children, and children their parents. This abandonment was not simple cruelty. It was driven by raw terror. People believed, correctly in the case of pneumonic plague, that merely being near the sick could transmit the disease. Boccaccio wrote bitterly about this dissolution of natural bonds. He described how the sick were left lying in the streets, with no one willing to approach them. He told of people who died alone in their homes, their bodies discovered only days later when the stench alerted neighbors. He noted how the rich, who had always counted on their wealth to insulate them from life's hardships, found that money could not buy safety or care when everyone was terrified. Yet Boccaccio also recorded acts of compassion. He mentioned individuals who cared for the sick out of love or duty, knowing they were likely condemning themselves to death. He wrote of physicians who stayed at their posts, trying frantically to find a cure or at least ease suffering. He described priests who heard confessions and gave blessings to the dying, exposing themselves repeatedly to infection because they believed their sacred duty outweighed personal safety. These heroes of the plague are largely anonymous. We know the names of some physicians who died treating patients, like Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's personal physician who survived plague but wrote about treating hundreds of victims in Avignon. We know of some clergy who became saints or were later honored for their service. But most who showed courage and compassion during the plague died forgotten, their names unrecorded, remembered only in the prayers of those they helped. For children who lived through the plague, the experience was particularly traumatic. Children watched their parents die, saw siblings carried away by the disease, witnessed the complete disruption of their world. Many were orphaned. These plague orphans became a significant social problem. In cities, orphanages were established, often by the church, to care for the flood of children who had no family. In rural areas, orphans were usually taken in by extended family or neighbors, but sometimes no one could be found to care for them. The psychological impact on children who survived was profound. They grew up in a world emptied of familiar faces, raised by people who were not their parents, in communities struggling to function. These children became adults in a transformed world, and their experiences shaped how the post-plague generation viewed life, risk, and mortality. The plague also had effects on pregnancy and childbirth. Pregnant women who contracted plague almost always lost their babies or died themselves or both. This added to the demographic catastrophe. Not only were millions dying, but births were not replacing them. Some midwives and healers who attended pregnant women caught the disease and died, creating a shortage of those who assisted with childbirth, which led to higher maternal and infant mortality even among those who did not have plague. Animals too were affected, though not directly by plague. Domestic animals starved when their owners died or fled. Cattle, pigs, chickens, and sheep wandered loose or died of neglect. Some animals thrived, particularly rats, which found abundant food in abandoned granaries and multiplied rapidly. Rats, of course, were the primary carriers of the infected fleas that spread the disease, though no one at the time understood this connection. The relationship between rats, fleas, and plague would not be understood for another 500 years. Medieval people noticed that rats sometimes died before plague outbreaks, but they did not recognize the significance. They thought of rats as simply another unpleasant aspect of urban life. The actual mechanism of transmission, fleas feeding on infected rats and then biting humans, remained completely unknown. In fact, the entire concept of contagion was poorly understood in medieval thought. Physicians and natural philosophers debated whether diseases could pass from person to person. Some argued yes, citing observations that those who cared for the sick often became sick themselves. Others argued that disease arose from internal imbalances in the body or from environmental factors like corrupted air, and that apparent contagion was really just multiple people being exposed to the same corrupt conditions. The Church taught that disease was ultimately under God's control. Plague was either divine punishment for sin or a test of faith. This theological framework shaped responses to the disease. If plague was God's judgment, then the proper response was repentance, prayer, and acceptance of His will. To flee from plague might be seen as rejecting God's plan. To try too hard to save one's life might suggest lack of faith in divine providence. Yet at the same time, the Church acknowledged that humans should take reasonable precautions and care for the sick. There was tension between fatalistic acceptance and practical action. Different religious authorities emphasized different aspects. Some preachers urged acceptance and piety. Others supported quarantine measures and encouraged people to protect themselves. This theological ambiguity meant that Christian responses to the plague varied widely across Europe. Jewish communities, as mentioned earlier, faced particular hardships during the plague. Beyond the violence directed at them, they also suffered from the disease itself. Jewish mortality rates from plague were comparable to Christian rates, despite accusations that Jews were somehow responsible for or immune to the disease. Jewish physicians, who were often more educated than their Christian counterparts, having access to Arabic medical texts, tried to treat plague patients of all faiths, sometimes risking their own lives. The plague strained not just religious but also governmental institutions. Kings and princes tried to maintain order, but their authority was challenged by the chaos. Laws and decrees were issued attempting to control the movement of people, regulate burials, and maintain public order. But enforcement was difficult when officials themselves were dying or fleeing. Some rulers showed remarkable leadership. King Philip VI of France tried to organize a medical faculty response to the plague at the University of Paris. The medical faculty produced a report on the causes and treatment of plague, which was disseminated across Europe. Though the report's understanding of the disease was wrong by modern standards, the attempt to gather expert opinion and provide guidance was significant. Other rulers simply fled to isolated country estates, hoping distance from populated areas would save them. This strategy sometimes worked. Remote castles or hunting lodges far from towns might escape the plague, at least temporarily. But rulers who fled were often criticized for abandoning their duties to their subjects. The papal court at Avignon, under Pope Clement VI, experienced plague directly. Thousands died in the city, including many cardinals and bishops. The Pope himself remained in Avignon, though his physicians advised him to stay isolated between two large fires, which may have helped keep fleas away. Clement tried to use his authority to combat some of the worst effects of the plague, particularly the persecution of Jews. He issued papal bulls condemning the violence and asserting that Jews were not responsible for the plague. These pronouncements had limited effect, but they stand as examples of moral leadership during crisis. Universities, centers of learning and training for clergy and physicians, were devastated. The University of Paris, the University of Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, all lost many students and faculty. Years of accumulated knowledge died with those scholars. The curriculum for training new physicians and theologians was disrupted. It would take decades for these institutions to recover fully, and some never regained their former prominence. The chroniclers of the age struggled to record what was happening. Many chroniclers were monks, and monasteries suffered high mortality. Chronicles of this period are often incomplete, with entries suddenly stopping when the chronicler died. Later hands would sometimes add notes explaining that plague had killed the previous author. Reading these documents today, we can sense the fear and confusion of those trying to make sense of catastrophe while living through it. The psychological scar left by the plague would never fully heal. Even generations later, the memory of the Great Mortality haunted Europe. It appeared in literature, art, and folk memory. Grandparents told grandchildren about the terrible days when death walked the streets and no one was safe. The plague became a reference point, a dividing line between the world before and the world after. Everything was dated as happening before or after the pestilence. This reshaping of memory and identity was as important as the economic and social changes. Medieval Europeans had thought of their world as stable, ordained by God, fundamentally unchanging. The plague shattered that illusion. It demonstrated that the world could transform utterly, that mass death was possible, that divine providence operated in mysterious and terrifying ways. This psychological shift opened the door to new ways of thinking, new questions about authority, religion, and the nature of existence itself. As we close this first part of our journey through the Black Death shadow, we stand at a pivotal moment. The first wave of the plague has passed. Millions have died. Europe is forever changed. But the story does not end here. The responses to the plague, the medical attempts to understand and treat it, the social and religious upheavals it triggered, the economic transformations it caused, the long-term consequences that reshaped civilization, all this lies ahead in our continuing exploration of history's deadliest pandemic. The attempts to understand and combat the plague reveal much about medieval thought and the limits of 14th century knowledge. When confronted with a disease that killed so indiscriminately and so rapidly, physicians, scholars, and religious authorities struggled to explain what was happening and why. The dominant medical theory of the time was based on the work of ancient physicians, particularly Galen and Hippocrates, whose ideas had been transmitted through Arabic scholarship and were considered authoritative. These ancient texts taught that health depended on the balance of four humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease resulted from imbalances in these humors, which could be caused by diet, climate, or celestial influences. When the plague arrived, physicians tried to fit it into this humoral framework. They theorized that the disease was caused by a corruption of the air, a miasma that upset the body's humoral balance. But what caused the air to become corrupted? Here, medical authorities looked to astrology. In 1345, there had been a conjunction of 3 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, in the sign of Aquarius. This alignment was believed to have drawn up evil vapors from the earth and sea, corrupting the atmosphere. The medical faculty at the University of Paris, asked by King Philip VI to investigate the plague's causes, produced a detailed report in October 1348. This Compendium de Epidemia attributed the plague to this planetary conjunction, combined with earthquakes that released poisonous fumes from deep in the earth. The report recommended various preventative measures, avoiding bad air, purifying the atmosphere with fire and pleasant scents, maintaining a good diet to keep the humors balanced, and bloodletting to remove corrupt blood. This explanation, though completely wrong, had a certain internal logic within medieval understanding. It explained why the plague was so widespread, the corrupted air could spread anywhere. It explained why treatment was difficult. Once the air was corrupted, restoring balance was challenging. And it placed the ultimate cause in celestial movements, which aligned with the belief that everything on earth reflected divine will expressed through the cosmos. Other theories circulated. Some blamed the plague on Jewish plots, as we have mentioned, or on lepers, beggars, or other marginalized groups supposedly trying to poison Christians. These conspiracy theories led to violence but had no basis in reality. Some authorities, noting that plagues seemed to spread from person to person, suggested contagion, though they could not explain the mechanism. The observation was correct, but without understanding bacteria or disease vectors, they could not develop effective responses based on this insight. Preventative measures varied widely. Authorities in some cities tried to implement quarantine policies. Venice, in 1348, required ships to remain at anchor for 40 days before passengers could disembark, giving rise to the term quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. This measure may have helped reduce plague transmission, though its effectiveness was limited since rats could still come ashore and people did not understand the role of fleas and rodents. Some cities tried to control the movement of people, forbidding travelers from plague-stricken areas. Others implemented regulations for dealing with the sick and the dead. Milan, one of the cities that suffered relatively less from the plague, reportedly sealed plague victims in their houses, sometimes boarding up entire buildings with the sick and healthy alike inside. This draconian measure may have slowed transmission but at a terrible human cost. Personal protective measures were also tried. Physicians who treated plague patients sometimes wore distinctive costumes. The iconic plague doctor costume, with its bird-like mask filled with aromatic herbs and long waxed robe, actually developed later, in the 17th century, but the concept of protective clothing existed in the 14th century as well. Physicians wore gloves, covered their faces, and carried staffs to avoid direct contact with patients. Common people tried their own protective measures. They carried flowers, herbs, or scented handkerchiefs, holding them to their noses when venturing outside. Rosemary, lavender, and roses were particularly favored, their pleasant scents thought to counteract corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods or incense in their homes. They avoided places where many people gathered, sensing correctly that crowds increased infection risk, though they did not understand why. Dietary recommendations were common. Physicians advised eating foods that would maintain humoral balance and strengthen the body. Meat, especially poultry, was considered good. Fresh fruits and vegetables were viewed with suspicion, thought to be cooling and moist, properties that might make the body more susceptible to disease. Wine was recommended, believed to warm and purify the body. Moderation in all things was advised. Excess in eating, drinking, or physical activity could upset the humors. Some recommendations verged on the bizarre. One physician suggested that people should face south to avoid breathing northern air, which he believed was more likely to be corrupted. Another recommended keeping chamber pots in living spaces, as the smell might drive away pestilential vapors. Yet another advised avoiding bathing, as opening the pores might allow corrupt air to enter the body. Treatments once plague symptoms appeared were no more effective. Bloodletting was attempted extensively. The theory was that plague caused blood to become corrupted, so removing corrupt blood might save the patient. Physicians would open a vein and let blood flow until the patient fainted, removing sometimes several pints. For patients already weakened by fever and disease, this blood loss often proved fatal. Purging was also common. Strong laxatives or emetics were administered to force the body to expel corrupt matter through vomiting or diarrhea. The violence of these treatments left patients dehydrated and exhausted. Some physicians combined bloodletting and purging, subjecting patients to both treatments in rapid succession, a regimen almost no one could survive. For the buboes themselves, the painful swellings that characterized plague, various treatments were attempted. Some physicians recommended lancing them with a hot blade, cutting into the swelling to drain the pus and blood. This procedure was agonizing and often led to secondary infections that killed the patient even if the plague did not. Others applied poultices, mixtures of herbs, animal fat, and other ingredients that supposedly would draw out the poison. Some of these poultices had truly strange ingredients. Dried toads were used, thought to absorb poison. Human excrement was applied, following ancient texts that claimed feces had powerful curative properties. Ground pearls or other gems were mixed into pastes, their purity supposedly able to counteract corruption. None of these treatments helped, and some probably harmed. A few treatments may have provided marginal benefit, though not for the reasons medieval people thought. Keeping patients warm and giving them liquids may have helped some survive, though physicians thought they were maintaining the body's heat and moisture to combat the disease's cold and dry nature. Lancing buboes, while painful and risky, occasionally allowed drainage that might have slightly improved a patient's chance of survival, though the risk of secondary infection was high. The vast majority of patients died regardless of treatment. This led to despair among physicians and a crisis of confidence in medical knowledge. If the most learned doctors, following the most authoritative texts, could not cure or even significantly help plague patients, what good was medicine? Some physicians abandoned their posts, fleeing to save their own lives. Others stayed but despaired of their ability to help, continuing only because their oath and conscience demanded it. Guy de Chauliac, the papal physician who treated plague patients in Avignon, wrote candidly about his fear and feelings of helplessness. He continued to see patients throughout the plague despite being terrified, and he himself contracted the disease but survived, perhaps one of the luckiest men in Europe. His writings on plague reflect both the courage and the confusion of medical practitioners facing a disease they could not understand or treat. The plague also led to changes in medical practice. The shortage of trained physicians meant that people turned increasingly to barber surgeons, apothecaries, and empirics, practitioners without formal university training. These individuals often charged less than university-trained physicians and sometimes were just as effective, which is to say, not at all, but at least they were available when university physicians had fled or died. Women played significant roles in medical care during the plague. Midwives and female healers, already important in medieval medicine, became even more crucial when male physicians were unavailable. These women treated patients with herbal remedies, provided comfort to the dying, and helped lay out the dead. Their contributions are often under-recognized in historical sources, which focused on male physicians, but they were essential to communities' ability to cope. The economic disruptions caused by the plague created opportunities for some medical practitioners. Demand for medical services remained high even though effectiveness was low. Physicians who stayed when others fled could charge premium rates. But this came at enormous personal risk. Many physicians who treated plague patients died, making medical practice during plague outbreaks a truly heroic, or perhaps foolhardy, endeavor. Religious responses to the plague were complex and varied. The Church's initial interpretation was that plague represented divine punishment for sin. This view had biblical precedents. God had sent plagues to punish the Egyptians, the Philistines, and others in the Old Testament. Medieval Christians saw themselves as part of this biblical narrative, so divine punishment through disease made theological sense. But this interpretation raised difficult questions. Why did the plague kill clergy and monks who had devoted their lives to God's service? Why did it strike children who had not had time to sin grievously? Why did it kill indiscriminately, not sparing the righteous while punishing the wicked? These questions troubled both clergy and lay people, creating a crisis of faith for some. One response was to intensify religious devotion. People flocked to churches to pray, confess their sins, and seek God's mercy. They made vows and promises, pledging to change their behavior if they survived. They undertook pilgrimages to holy sites, seeking the intercession of saints. Some made substantial donations to the church, founding masses to be said in perpetuity for their souls and the souls of loved ones who had died. The church responded by offering special masses and prayers against the plague. Saints were invoked, particularly Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, both associated with protection from pestilence. Processions were organized where participants marched through streets carrying holy relics and singing hymns, publicly demonstrating piety in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. But these mass gatherings probably helped spread the disease, bringing infected and susceptible people together. No one understood this at the time, and the failure of religious processions and prayers to stop the plague troubled many people. If piety could not protect them, what could? This erosion of confidence in traditional religious practices would have long-term consequences. The flagellant movement, mentioned earlier, represented a more extreme religious response. These groups believed that by voluntarily inflicting suffering on themselves, they were doing penance for humanity's sins and might persuade God to end the plague. They traveled from town to town, often in groups of 50 to 500, performing public rituals of self-flagellation. The flagellants followed a strict regimen. They wore simple robes marked with red crosses. They walked in pairs, singing hymns. When they reached a town's main square, they would strip to the waist and begin beating themselves with scourges, leather straps embedded with iron spikes. They would strike their backs, drawing blood, while reciting prayers and confessing sins. The ritual lasted for hours, and they repeated it twice a day for 33.5 days, symbolizing the years of Christ's life. Initially, many people welcomed the flagellants. Their dramatic displays of piety seemed like the kind of extreme devotion that might move God to mercy. Communities provided food and shelter to flagellant groups. Some people joined the movement, caught up in its intensity and the promise that suffering might bring salvation. But the movement soon became problematic. The flagellants began to claim that their rituals were more effective than the Church's sacraments. They preached without authorization, challenging ecclesiastical authority. They attacked Jews and other groups they deemed sinful. They collected money and functioned as an independent religious movement outside church control. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants in October 1349. He declared their practices contrary to church teaching and ordered them to disband. His condemnation was enforced by local authorities, who arrested flagellant leaders and broke up their groups. The movement largely disappeared by 1350, though it would resurface occasionally in later centuries during times of crisis. The persecution of Jews during the plague was one of its most horrific consequences. The charge that Jews caused the plague by poisoning wells was absurd, but it gained widespread belief. The violence began in southern France and Spain in 1348 but reached its peak in the German lands in 1348 and 1349. In town after town, Jewish communities were attacked. In some places, Jews were given the choice of conversion or death, though conversion often did not save them as mobs accused them of being insincere. In many cases, entire communities were herded into wooden buildings or specially constructed enclosures and burned alive. The screams of the dying mixed with the crackle of flames as hundreds or thousands perished. Strasbourg's massacre on February 14, 1349, was particularly brutal. Nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the Jewish cemetery. The atrocity occurred months before plague even reached the city, demonstrating that the violence was not really about disease but about deep-seated antisemitism that found an excuse in the plague panic. Some authorities tried to protect Jewish communities. Pope Clement issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 condemning the violence and asserting that Jews were not responsible for the plague. He noted, logically, that Jews were dying of plague just like Christians. Emperor Charles IV also issued edicts protecting Jews, though these were often ignored. Some local rulers provided sanctuary, sometimes for humanitarian reasons, sometimes because they owed money to Jewish lenders and conveniently dead creditors meant cancelled debts. The destruction of Jewish communities had long-lasting effects. In many German cities, Jews did not return for generations, if ever. The cultural and economic contributions these communities made were lost. The violence also hardened antisemitism, establishing patterns of scapegoating that would recur in European history. The social upheaval caused by the plague extended beyond anti-Jewish violence. The breakdown of social order manifested in various ways. Crime increased in many areas as law enforcement collapsed. Bands of criminals and desperate people roamed the countryside, taking advantage of the chaos. Some turned to banditry, robbing travelers and raiding isolated farms. In some regions, peasants rebelled against their lords. The seeds of these rebellions were planted during the plague itself, but they would fully flower in subsequent decades. The labor shortage gave peasants bargaining power they had never possessed. Lords tried to maintain the old feudal arrangements, but peasants increasingly demanded better wages, more freedom, and better treatment. When lords resisted, conflict resulted. The most famous of these rebellions, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, occurred a generation after the initial plague but was directly related to it. The revolt was triggered by attempts to enforce old labor laws and collect a poll tax, but its deeper causes lay in the social changes unleashed by the plague. Similar revolts occurred in France, the Jacquerie of 1358, and in Florence, the Ciompi Revolt of 1378. The church itself faced internal challenges. The high mortality among clergy, perhaps 40 to 50% died in many regions, created an immediate shortage. Parishes were left without priests. This opened positions for men who might not have qualified in normal times. The standard of clerical education and conduct dropped as less prepared men entered the priesthood to fill empty positions. This decline in clerical quality contributed to growing criticism of the church. Lay people observed that prayers had not stopped the plague. They saw clergy flee while some lay people stayed to help. They noticed the drop in standards as poorly educated priests performed sacraments. These observations fed existing currents of criticism that would eventually contribute to movements for church reform. The economic transformation that the plague triggered unfolded over decades, but its outlines were visible almost immediately. The most obvious change was the labor shortage. With perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population dead, workers who had been abundant became scarce. This shifted economic power dramatically. Peasants and laborers found they could demand higher wages. Lords who wanted their fields cultivated had to pay more or offer better conditions. In England, wages approximately doubled in the decade after the plague. Similar increases occurred across Europe. For workers, this was unprecedented. For generations, wages had been stable and low. Now, ordinary people had bargaining power. Landlords tried to resist these changes. In England, the Statute of Labourers was passed in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' mobility. Similar laws were enacted in other countries. But economic reality could not be legislated away. Labour shortages meant the laws were widely ignored or evaded. Workers demanded their market value, and employers who wanted work done had to pay it. Agricultural patterns shifted substantially. With fewer workers, marginal land that had been cultivated during the population boom was abandoned. This actually increased agricultural efficiency. The best land continued to be farmed, and productivity per worker increased. The medieval agricultural crisis, where population had grown beyond what the land could sustainably support, was solved by the terrible expedient of mass death. The abandoned lands reverted to forest or pasture. Sheep farming expanded, requiring less labor than crop cultivation. This shift toward pastoralism had significant economic effects, particularly in England, where wool production became increasingly important. The wool trade enriched England and contributed to the rise of a merchant class that would become politically significant. Urban economies also transformed. Guilds, which controlled craft production in medieval cities, faced labor shortages. Apprentices and journeymen who had waited years for master craftsmen to die and open positions suddenly found opportunities everywhere. Young workers could become independent artisans decades earlier than normal. This created social mobility that had been nearly impossible before. The sudden availability of property affected urban life dramatically. Houses, shops, and warehouses stood empty, their owners dead. Survivors could acquire property at low prices or even simply occupy abandoned buildings. This redistribution of real estate benefited some while angering those who had inherited wealth before the plague and now saw their relative status decline. Women's economic roles expanded during and after the plague. With so many men dead, women took on work traditionally performed by males. Widows inherited and ran businesses. Women worked in fields, in workshops, in trades that normally excluded them. Not all these changes proved permanent, as society eventually pushed women back toward traditional roles, but the plague years demonstrated that women could perform these tasks competently. The financial sector was severely disrupted. Many banking families failed, as mentioned earlier. Credit networks collapsed when lenders died and borrowers could not be found or refused to honor old debts. It took decades for banking and finance to recover to pre-plague levels of sophistication. The Italian city-states, particularly Florence and Genoa, which had dominated European finance, saw their position weakened. Trade patterns changed as well. Long-distance trade, particularly with the East, declined temporarily. The routes that had brought the plague were now feared. Merchants were less willing to travel. Ships stayed in port. The Silk Road trade, already declining before the plague due to the breakup of the Mongol Empire, was further disrupted. European commerce became somewhat more regional and local in the immediate post-plague period. Prices fluctuated wildly in the years after the plague. With population down but the money supply relatively unchanged, inflation occurred in some sectors. At the same time, luxury goods became cheaper as demand from the wealthy fell. Land values plummeted since there were fewer people to farm or occupy the land. Grain prices varied depending on local conditions, harvest success, and remaining population levels. The long-term economic effects were complex. Initially, surviving workers benefited from higher wages and more opportunities. But over time, landlords adapted. They shifted from labor-intensive grain cultivation to less labor-intensive sheep farming. They enclosed common lands that peasants had traditionally used, converting them to private pastures. These enclosures displaced peasants and created social tensions that would simmer for centuries. The cultural and psychological impact of the plague manifested in various ways. Art and literature began to reflect the omnipresence of death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as an artistic motif. These paintings and murals showed skeletons or personified death leading people from all walks of life, popes and emperors, merchants and peasants, in a dance to the grave. The earliest known danse macabre mural was painted around 1424 at the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris. Though this was decades after the initial plague, the motif was a direct response to the plague experience. The images showed that death came for everyone, regardless of status or wealth. This was a radical statement in a highly hierarchical society, suggesting that before death, all humans were equal. The theme of memento mori, remember you must die, became increasingly prominent. Artworks included skulls, hourglasses, and other symbols of mortality. Tomb sculpture changed, with some tombs showing the deceased not as they appeared in life but as decomposing corpses, a stark reminder of physical decay. This macabre imagery reflected a society traumatized by mass death. Literature of the period also engaged with plague themes. Boccaccio's Decameron, written between 1349 and 1353, is set during the plague. Its frame narrative describes 10 young people fleeing Florence to escape the disease. While isolated in a villa, they tell each other stories. The Decameron's tales range from bawdy comedy to moral instruction, but the plague context frames everything, a reminder of death lurking outside their temporary refuge. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, includes references to the plague. The Pardoner's Tale features 3 men who go searching for death to kill him and instead find gold, which leads to their own deaths. The allegory reflects plague-era preoccupations with mortality and the futility of trying to escape death. Religious art evolved as well. Images of the crucifixion became more graphic and agonized, perhaps reflecting the suffering people had witnessed during the plague. The Black Madonna, a representation of the Virgin Mary with dark skin, may have originated or become more popular due to the plague, the darkness symbolically connected to death and suffering while Mary's intercession offered hope. Poetry written during or shortly after the plague often expressed despair, questioning, and attempts to find meaning. William Langland's Piers Plowman, written in English in the 1370s, grapples with questions of sin, salvation, and social justice in a world marked by plague's devastation. The poem critiques corruption in church and society, themes that resonated with people who had seen traditional authorities fail during crisis. Popular culture was also affected. Folk songs and ballads about plague were composed and transmitted orally. The nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is sometimes claimed to refer to plague symptoms, the ring of roses representing the circular rash associated with some plague cases, though this interpretation is disputed by scholars. Whether or not specific songs originated during the plague, death and disease became more prominent themes in popular culture. The plague influenced changes in religious practice and belief. The popularity of saints associated with plague, especially Saints Sebastian and Roch, increased dramatically. Shrines dedicated to these saints saw increases in pilgrimages. New religious confraternities were founded, often dedicated to caring for plague victims or burying the dead. These organizations played important social roles in subsequent centuries. The ars moriendi, or art of dying well, became an important genre of religious literature. These texts provided guidance for preparing for death, how to confess, how to resist temptation in one's final moments, how to ensure salvation. The fact that such literature proliferated reflects how death had become an immediate concern for everyone in post-plague Europe. Some historians argue that the plague experience contributed to changing attitudes toward the afterlife. Purgatory, the intermediate state where souls were purified before entering heaven, became more emphasized in Catholic theology and popular belief. The massive number of deaths created concern for the fate of so many souls, and the concept of purgatory, along with masses said for the dead, provided a framework for the living to help deceased loved ones. The plague may also have contributed to mystical religious movements. With traditional religious authorities seemingly unable to stop the plague, some people turned to more personal, mystical forms of spirituality. Figures like Julian of Norwich, a 14th-century English mystic, gained followings. Julian's revelations of divine love, describing visions she received, emphasizes God's love and comfort, perhaps offering consolation to a traumatized society. The long-term consequences of the plague extended for centuries. The population of Europe did not return to pre-plague levels until the 16th century, some 150 to 200 years later. This prolonged demographic depression had profound effects. With fewer people, Europe remained a less crowded place. Land was less scarce. Resources per capita were higher. This actually contributed to improved living standards for many survivors and their descendants. Real wages remained high for a century or more after the plague. People ate better, lived in less crowded conditions, and generally had more material comfort than their great-grandparents before the plague. This paradoxical improvement in living standards resulting from catastrophic mortality is one of history's grim ironies. The social structure of Europe evolved partly because of plague-induced changes. The feudal system, already under pressure, weakened further. Serfs gained freedom as lords needed to offer incentives to keep workers. The Black Death did not end feudalism immediately, but it accelerated its decline. By the 16th century, serfdom had disappeared in much of Western Europe, though it persisted longer in Eastern Europe. The rise of a commercial middle class was facilitated by the plague's disruptions. With labor scarce and expensive, there were incentives to develop labor-saving techniques and technologies. Investment in capital equipment increased. Trade networks adapted to the new demographic reality. Merchants and traders who survived often prospered, accumulating wealth that gave them increasing social and political influence. Educational institutions adapted as well. Universities, which had suffered in the plague, eventually recovered and even expanded. The shortage of educated clergy created demand for education. New universities were founded in the late 14th and 15th centuries. The curriculum began to evolve, though slowly, incorporating new ideas alongside traditional scholastic learning. The plague also influenced the development of public health measures. Italian city-states pioneered quarantine regulations. Venice established the first permanent health magistracy in 1486, with powers to enforce quarantine and sanitation measures. These early public health institutions laid groundwork for modern epidemiology and disease control. The concept of hospitals evolved during and after the plague. Previously, hospitals were primarily charitable institutions providing shelter for the poor and dying rather than places of medical treatment. The plague experience led to increased interest in institutions that could isolate the sick and perhaps provide care. This contributed to the gradual transformation of hospitals into medical facilities. The recurring nature of plague in subsequent centuries had its own impacts. The Black Death was not a single event but the beginning of the second pandemic of plague, which lasted until the 18th century. Plague returned periodically, sometimes in major outbreaks that killed tens of thousands, other times in smaller local epidemics. These recurrences kept the fear of plague alive for generations. Some of these later outbreaks were significant. The plague returned to England in 1361, 1369, and 1375. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed perhaps 100,000 people. The Marseille Plague of 1720 was one of the last major outbreaks in Western Europe. Each recurrence traumatized affected populations and reinforced the cultural memory of the Black Death. The recurring plague had economic effects as well. Every few decades, another outbreak would disrupt trade, kill workers, and redistribute property. This recurring shock prevented Europe from fully recovering demographically for centuries. It may also have contributed to economic innovation, as societies adapted to periodic labor shortages and disruptions. The discovery of what actually caused plague came much later. 4 centuries after the Black Death, physicians remained ignorant of the disease's true nature. It was not until 1894, more than 500 years after the Black Death, that the plague bacterium was identified. In that year, an outbreak of plague in Hong Kong attracted international scientific attention. Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French bacteriologist, traveled to Hong Kong to investigate. On June 20, 1894, Yersin successfully isolated the bacterium responsible for plague. It was eventually named Yersinia pestis in his honor. Simultaneously, Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo was conducting similar research, and both men are sometimes credited with the discovery. A few years later, in 1898, French scientist Paul-Louis Simond demonstrated that fleas were the vector transmitting plague from rats to humans. This explained the mechanism of transmission that had been mysterious for centuries. Rats hosted the bacteria, fleas fed on infected rats, and then transmitted the disease to humans through their bites. These discoveries revolutionized understanding of plague and enabled effective control measures. Rat control, flea control, and antibiotics when they were developed in the 20th century meant plague could be prevented and treated. By the mid-20th century, plague had become a rare and treatable disease, though it still occurs occasionally in some parts of the world. The genetic study of Yersinia pestis has revealed much about the Black Death. Scientists have extracted and sequenced plague DNA from medieval remains found in plague burial sites. This research confirms that the Black Death was indeed caused by Yersinia pestis and has allowed researchers to trace the evolution of the bacterium. Interestingly, this research shows that all modern plague strains descended from the strain that caused the Black Death. The medieval pandemic was not just a historical catastrophe but an evolutionary event that shaped the disease that still exists today. The bacterium that caused the Black Death was the ancestor of all current plague bacteria. Modern research has also shed light on the plague's origins and transmission patterns. DNA analysis of plague victims from different European cities has revealed that multiple strains of the bacteria entered Europe, suggesting several independent introductions from Central Asia. This explains why the plague spread so quickly and comprehensively. It was not one wave but multiple waves coming from different directions. The study of medieval skeletons from mass graves has provided other insights. Bone analysis reveals information about the health and nutrition of plague victims before they died. Many show signs of malnutrition and other health problems, supporting the theory that the population was already weakened by the Great Famine and other stresses when the plague arrived. This pre-existing vulnerability may explain why mortality was so high. Archaeological excavations of plague burial sites continue to uncover evidence about the pandemic. In London, the construction of a railway uncovered a mass grave at Charterhouse Square containing over 600 individuals who died during the Black Death. Analysis of these remains has provided valuable data about the disease and its victims. Similarly, excavations in France, Italy, and other countries have uncovered plague cemeteries that tell stories of the pandemic's impact. The political consequences of the Black Death were substantial and long-lasting. Monarchies and governments faced unprecedented challenges. The loss of tax revenue due to decreased population strained royal finances. Military campaigns became harder to sustain as armies could not be raised or supplied. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which was ongoing when the plague struck, was significantly affected. Both England and France found their military capabilities diminished. England had been winning the early phases of the war, but after the plague, maintaining large armies in France became difficult. France, devastated by both war and plague, saw its countryside ravaged and depopulated. The war continued intermittently, but the plague had changed the strategic situation. Neither side could muster the resources for the kind of sustained campaigns that had characterized earlier phases of the conflict. The plague also affected royal succession and dynastic politics. As mentioned earlier, Princess Joan of England died of plague while traveling to her wedding in Spain. Her death was not an isolated incident. Numerous nobles and royal family members across Europe died of the disease, disrupting carefully planned marriages and alliances. The political map of Europe might have been quite different if certain key figures had not died of plague at crucial moments. The Holy Roman Empire, already a loose confederation of territories, became even more fragmented. Emperor Charles IV tried to maintain authority, but the plague weakened central power. Local princes and cities gained more autonomy as imperial authority proved unable to provide protection or solutions during the crisis. This decentralization would characterize the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. In Spain, the various Christian kingdoms were in the process of reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. The plague disrupted this centuries-long process. King Alfonso XI of Castile's death from plague in 1350 halted military campaigns against Granada, the last major Muslim kingdom in Iberia. The Reconquista slowed, and it would not be completed until 1492, more than a century later. The Italian city-states, wealthy and powerful before the plague, were devastated but adapted in interesting ways. Venice, Florence, Genoa, and others lost huge portions of their populations. Their economic dominance was challenged. But they also pioneered new governmental approaches in response to the crisis. Public health boards were established. Poor relief was organized more systematically. These innovations in urban governance would influence European political development. The relationship between the church and secular authorities shifted subtly but significantly. When the plague struck, neither religious nor secular leaders could stop it. This shared failure somewhat leveled their standing in popular estimation. Moreover, the need for coordinated responses to the plague led to increased cooperation between church and state. Public health measures required both religious and secular authority to be effective. The concept of state power and responsibility began to evolve. Governments that tried to respond to the plague through quarantines, sanitation measures, and coordination of medical care were asserting new kinds of authority over their populations. This expansion of governmental role, tentative and incomplete in the 14th century, laid groundwork for the more powerful states that would emerge in early modern Europe. The plague also affected military technology and tactics. With fewer men available for armies, there was increased interest in labor-saving military technologies. Gunpowder weapons, which had been used in Europe since the early 14th century but were still primitive, received more investment. Cannons and firearms could make smaller forces more effective, compensating somewhat for manpower shortages. The social mobility created by the plague had military implications as well. The old knightly class, the armored cavalry that had dominated medieval warfare, was based on a feudal system that the plague undermined. As this system weakened, armies increasingly relied on mercenaries and professional soldiers rather than feudal levies. This professionalization of military forces would characterize the late medieval and early modern periods. The plague's impact on literature and intellectual life extended beyond the immediate post-plague period. A generation of scholars and writers who grew up in the shadow of the plague produced works that reflected their experiences. The University of Padua, the University of Bologna, and other Italian universities became centers of humanist learning, partly as a response to the plague's disruptions. Humanism, the intellectual movement that emphasized classical learning and human potential, flourished in the post-plague environment. Some historians argue that the plague contributed to this by disrupting traditional scholastic education and creating opportunities for new approaches. The emphasis on human experience and earthly life in humanist thought may have been influenced by the plague's stark reminder of mortality and the failures of traditional learning to explain or prevent catastrophe. Petrarch, the great Italian poet and scholar often called the father of humanism, lived through the plague. He lost friends and patrons to the disease. His writings reflect deep melancholy about the world's transience and the brevity of life. Yet Petrarch also emphasized the dignity and potential of humanity, themes that would become central to Renaissance humanism. The vernacular literature that flourished in the late 14th and 15th centuries owed something to the plague as well. Before the plague, most serious literature was written in Latin. But the disruption of traditional education and the deaths of so many Latin-educated clergy created more space for writing in local languages. Boccaccio's Decameron was in Italian, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in English, works in French, German, Spanish, and other vernacular languages proliferated. This vernacularization of literature had profound implications. It made sophisticated writing accessible to broader audiences. It contributed to the development of national literary traditions and, eventually, national identities. The plague, by disrupting the Latin-educated clerical elite, inadvertently opened doors for vernacular culture. The economic innovations spurred by the plague were numerous and significant. Labor-saving technologies received more attention and investment. Water mills and windmills, already in use before the plague, became more widespread. Mechanical clocks, a 14th century innovation, spread across Europe, partly because cities wanted to regulate working hours more precisely in an era of labor scarcity and wage disputes. Agricultural technology gradually improved as well. Better plows, improved crop rotation systems, and more efficient use of draft animals all helped compensate for labor shortages. The agricultural improvements that would culminate in the agricultural revolution of later centuries had some of their roots in the post-plague period's need to produce more with fewer workers. The financial innovations of the Italian banking families, disrupted by the plague, eventually recovered and evolved. Double-entry bookkeeping, which had been developing before the plague, became more standardized afterward. This accounting innovation allowed for better tracking of complex business transactions, facilitating the commercial expansion of the late medieval and early modern periods. Insurance is another financial innovation that developed partly in response to plague and other catastrophes. Marine insurance, covering ships and cargoes against loss, became more sophisticated. The concept of pooling risk, which is fundamental to insurance, made more sense in a world where catastrophic loss had become vivid and recent memory. The textile industry, crucial to European medieval economy, transformed significantly after the plague. England's wool production, as mentioned, expanded. But the plague also affected cloth manufacturing in the Low Countries and Italy. Labor shortages led to the adoption of more efficient techniques and equipment. The fulling mill, used to clean and thicken cloth, became more common. These improvements helped maintain textile production despite reduced workforces. Mining and metallurgy saw innovations as well. Labor shortages in mines encouraged the development of better pumping systems to drain water and ventilation systems to provide fresh air. These improvements made deeper mining possible, accessing richer ore deposits. The metals produced, especially iron for tools and weapons, were essential for economic recovery and growth. The shipbuilding industry adapted to new realities. With fewer sailors available, there was interest in ships that could be operated by smaller crews. This led to innovations in ship design and rigging. The caravel, which would be so important in the age of exploration, incorporated design elements developed partly in response to labor scarcity. Speaking of exploration, the age of discovery that began in the 15th century had complex connections to the Black Death. The plague disrupted overland trade routes to Asia, making the search for sea routes more attractive. Portuguese and Spanish exploration of routes around Africa and across the Atlantic had economic motivations rooted partly in the post-plague reordering of trade patterns. Moreover, the psychological impact of surviving catastrophe may have contributed to the exploratory spirit. A generation that had seen the world turned upside down by plague might be more willing to take risks, to sail into unknown waters, to question old certainties. This is speculative, but there may be a connection between the trauma and transformation of the plague era and the adventurousness of the age of exploration. The Ottoman Empire's rise to dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean and Balkans was also connected to the plague. The Byzantine Empire, already weak, was further devastated by plague. Its population and resources declined at a crucial time when the Ottomans were expanding. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, ending the 1,000-year Roman Empire in the East, might not have occurred, or might have been delayed, if the plague had not so weakened Byzantium. Similarly, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria was weakened by plague, contributing to its eventual conquest by the Ottomans in 1517. The political map of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East was partly shaped by differential impacts of the plague on various powers. In Russia, the plague contributed to the consolidation of power around Moscow. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which would eventually become the Russian Empire, expanded its territory and influence partly by filling power vacuums created when neighboring principalities were devastated by plague. Ivan I and his successors capitalized on the disruptions to extend Muscovite authority. The plague's demographic impact had environmental consequences that are sometimes overlooked. The reforestation of abandoned agricultural lands sequestered carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Some scientists have even suggested that the massive die-off during the Black Death, reducing human activity and allowing forests to regrow, may have contributed to the Little Ice Age, the period of cooler temperatures that lasted from roughly the 14th to the 19th century. This is controversial, but it illustrates how the plague's effects extended into unexpected domains. The artistic legacy of the plague is rich and complex. Beyond the danse macabre and memento mori themes already mentioned, the plague influenced artistic styles and patronage patterns. The loss of so many patrons and artists disrupted existing workshop systems. Artistic styles evolved partly because the transmission of techniques from master to apprentice was interrupted. In painting, there was a shift toward more emotional and dramatic representations. The calm, idealized figures of earlier medieval art gave way to more expressive and sometimes agonized forms. This shift is visible in works like the Isenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald, painted in the early 16th century but reflecting post-plague sensibilities. The altarpiece's crucifixion scene shows Christ's body covered in sores, possibly reflecting the experience of plague and other diseases. Sculpture also reflected the plague's impact. Tomb sculpture became more elaborate and more focused on mortality. The transi tomb, showing the deceased as a rotting corpse, became a recognized form. These were graphic reminders of physical decay, quite different from the idealized images of the deceased that had been more common before the plague. Architecture saw fewer immediate changes, since major building projects took decades and required resources that were scarce after the plague. However, the late Gothic style that developed in the 15th century may have been influenced by the post-plague cultural climate. The elaborate, soaring forms of late Gothic churches, with their emphasis on light and verticality, could be seen as reaching toward heaven from a world that had experienced hell on earth. Music and liturgy were affected as well. New musical forms developed for masses for the dead, requiems that honored the millions who had perished. Composers created works that expressed mourning and hope for salvation. The Dies Irae, a medieval Latin hymn about Judgment Day, became a central part of the Requiem Mass and has been set to music by countless composers over the centuries. Popular music and folk traditions also bear traces of the plague. Songs about death, dances about mortality, cautionary tales about the fragility of life, all these became more common in the repertoire of traveling entertainers and local festivals. Some of these traditions persisted for centuries, keeping alive the memory of the plague in popular culture. The impact on daily life and material culture was substantial. Clothing styles evolved partly because of the plague. With labor more expensive, there was increased interest in clothing that was easier to make and maintain. Simpler cuts and designs became more common. At the same time, those who had survived and prospered sometimes displayed their wealth through elaborate dress, creating tensions that led to sumptuary laws attempting to regulate who could wear what. Housing also changed. The availability of more space meant that surviving families often moved to larger, better houses. The crowded conditions that had facilitated plague transmission were reduced. This may have contributed to better health outcomes for subsequent generations. Urban planning, such as it existed in medieval cities, began to consider issues of sanitation and crowding more seriously. Diet improved for many survivors. With higher incomes and more available land, people could afford more varied and nutritious food. Meat consumption increased for the lower classes. This improved nutrition likely contributed to better health and may have helped populations eventually recover from the plague's demographic catastrophe. The psychological and cultural trauma of the plague persisted for generations. Survivors carried memories of the horror they had witnessed. They passed these memories to their children and grandchildren. The plague became a defining event in family and community histories, a reference point for understanding misfortune and survival. This collective trauma influenced behavior in complex ways. Some people became more cautious and risk-averse, having seen how quickly fortune could turn. Others became more willing to take chances, feeling that since death could come at any time, one might as well pursue opportunities while alive. These contrasting responses to trauma coexisted in post-plague society, creating a dynamic and sometimes contradictory cultural atmosphere. Religious life continued to evolve in response to the plague's challenges. New religious orders were founded, often focused on charitable work or serving the sick. The Alexians, for example, were a lay religious order that specialized in caring for plague victims and burying the dead. Their work was dangerous, and many Alexians died of plague, but they provided essential services to affected communities. The cult of saints expanded to include more plague saints. In addition to Sebastian and Roch, various local saints were invoked against plague. Shrines associated with miraculous plague cures became pilgrimage destinations. This proliferation of plague-related religious practices shows how deeply the disease had penetrated medieval consciousness. Theological debates about the plague continued for decades. Why had God allowed such suffering? Was the plague punishment for specific sins? If so, which sins? Could prayer and penance prevent future outbreaks? These questions troubled theologians and laypeople alike. Various answers were proposed, but none fully satisfied everyone, leaving a legacy of religious uncertainty and questioning. This questioning spirit may have contributed to the religious upheavals of the later medieval and Reformation periods. When traditional religious authorities could not explain or prevent catastrophe, their authority was implicitly questioned. This created openings for alternative religious ideas and eventually for the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The development of printing in the mid-15th century was not directly caused by the plague, but it occurred in the post-plague environment. The Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, revolutionized the spread of information. Printed books made knowledge more accessible, which helped rebuild the intellectual infrastructure that the plague had damaged. The printing press allowed for the faster dissemination of medical, religious, and philosophical ideas. The plague also influenced the development of universities and education more broadly. After the initial devastation, universities recovered and in some cases expanded. New universities were founded in the late 14th and 15th centuries. The curriculum gradually evolved, incorporating more humanistic and practical studies alongside traditional scholastic theology and philosophy. Medical education improved, though slowly. Universities began to emphasize observation and experience more, partly because the plague had shown the limits of book learning alone. Anatomy, previously little studied, received more attention. Dissections of human corpses, though still restricted by religious concerns, became more common in medical training. These changes laid groundwork for the medical advances of the Renaissance and early modern periods. Legal systems also evolved in response to plague-related issues. Laws governing inheritance became more complex to deal with cases where entire families had died. Regulations about wills and estates had to adapt to unprecedented situations. Contract law developed to handle cases where parties to agreements had died before fulfilling their obligations. These legal innovations, developed in response to plague chaos, became permanent parts of European legal systems. Property law evolved as well. With so much property changing hands through death and inheritance, disputes were common. Courts developed precedents for dealing with competing claims. The concept of documentary evidence and written records became more important, as oral testimony was less reliable when so many potential witnesses had died. Labor law was transformed by the plague. Before the plague, workers had few rights and little bargaining power. After the plague, despite authorities' attempts to enforce the old terms, workers gradually gained more legal protections. The right to move in search of better wages, the right to negotiate pay, these concepts, revolutionary in the medieval context, gained ground in the post-plague period. Public health law emerged as a distinct field. Quarantine regulations, sanitation requirements, powers to isolate the sick, all these legal tools were developed or expanded in response to the plague. These laws set precedents for state involvement in public health that would develop further in subsequent centuries. The philosophical implications of the plague were profound. Medieval philosophy, dominated by scholasticism and focused on reconciling Christian theology with Aristotelian logic, was challenged by the plague's inexplicability within existing frameworks. If God was just and omnipotent, why did the plague kill good and evil alike? If natural philosophy could explain the world, why could it neither predict nor stop the plague? These questions did not immediately overturn medieval philosophy, but they contributed to a gradual shift toward more empirical and skeptical approaches. The Renaissance philosophers who followed would emphasize observation, experimentation, and a willingness to question authority. The plague's demonstration of the limits of traditional learning may have contributed to this intellectual shift. The concept of causation was particularly affected. Medieval thinkers had relied on Aristotelian causes, formal, material, efficient, and final. But plagues seemed to defy explanation in these terms. What was the efficient cause of an epidemic that spread so widely? What was the final cause, or purpose, of such universal suffering? These difficulties contributed to evolving understandings of causation that would eventually lead to modern scientific approaches. The ethics of care and duty were tested by the plague. Medieval ethical thought emphasized duties to family, community, and lord. But what were these duties when caring for a sick family member might kill you? When staying in your community meant likely death while fleeing might save you? The plague forced people to confront these dilemmas in ways that challenged existing ethical frameworks. Some ethicists argued that fleeing plague was morally acceptable, even for those with responsibilities, since staying meant almost certain death with no guarantee of helping others. Others argued that duties persisted even in the face of mortal danger. These debates continued through subsequent plague outbreaks and influenced broader ethical thinking about duty and self-preservation. The experience of the plague also influenced concepts of community and solidarity. In the midst of catastrophe, people saw both the worst and best of human nature. The abandonment of the sick and the violence against scapegoats showed humanity's capacity for cruelty and fear. But acts of selfless care and compassion demonstrated nobility and courage. These contrasting experiences shaped how post-plague society understood social bonds and moral obligations. The environmental impact of the plague, beyond the reforestation already mentioned, included changes in animal populations. With fewer humans, wild animal populations rebounded. Forests and wetlands that had been cleared or drained for agriculture returned to their natural states. This had effects on biodiversity, with some species recovering populations that had been diminished by human expansion. However, other species were affected negatively. The expansion of rats during the plague years meant that rats became even more established as human commensals, animals that live in close association with humans. This would have long-term consequences, as rats would continue to spread diseases and consume stored food for centuries. The plague also affected agricultural pests and diseases. With less intensive farming on marginal lands, some agricultural pest populations may have declined. But in other ways, the disruption of agriculture created opportunities for plant diseases and pests to flourish. The complex ecological effects of the plague's demographic catastrophe would have played out over decades and centuries. Climate and the plague had complex interactions. As mentioned, the Little Ice Age was beginning around the time of the Black Death. Cooler temperatures affected agriculture, trade routes, and disease patterns. Some historians have argued that climate change contributed to the plague's severity by stressing populations already. Others suggest that the demographic collapse caused by plague affected climate through changes in land use. These interactions remain subjects of ongoing research. The military consequences of the plague extended beyond the immediate effects on the 100 Years' War and other conflicts. The nature of warfare itself began to evolve. With feudal armies more difficult to raise, monarchs increasingly relied on mercenary companies, professional soldiers who fought for pay. This mercenary system had both advantages and disadvantages, creating effective forces but also problems within discipline and loyalty. Fortification and siege warfare were affected by population changes. Some cities shrank so much that their walls enclosed more space than needed. In other cases, fortifications were updated with new designs incorporating gunpowder artillery, another adaptation to changing military technology and demographics. Naval warfare saw changes as well. With fewer sailors available, navies had to innovate. Ship designs evolved to require smaller crews. Naval tactics adapted to the reality of having fewer but potentially more skilled sailors. These changes would influence European naval dominance in subsequent centuries. The cultural exchange between Europe and other regions was affected by the plague. The disruption of Silk Road trade, mentioned earlier, reduced contact between Europe and East Asia. But it also created incentives to find alternative routes, contributing eventually to the age of exploration. European expansion into the Atlantic and beyond had roots partly in the post-plague reordering of trade patterns. The plague also shaped European attitudes toward distant lands and peoples. Since the disease had come from the East, there was sometimes suspicion or fear of Eastern goods and people. But there was also fascination with distant regions and curiosity about different societies. These mixed attitudes would influence European expansion and colonialism in subsequent centuries. The impact on women's lives, mentioned briefly before, deserves more attention. During and after the plague, women gained economic opportunities as workers and property owners. Widows, especially, often found themselves in control of businesses and estates. While much of this economic power was eventually clawed back by patriarchal social structures, the plague years demonstrated that women could manage these responsibilities effectively. Women's roles in medicine and healing also became more prominent. With many male physicians dead or absent, women healers, midwives, and herbalists provided essential care. Some of these women were later persecuted as witches, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, but during the plague they were often valued members of their communities. Educational opportunities for women did not expand much in the immediate aftermath of the plague, but the overall disruption of social structures created some openings. A few women gained access to education and literacy that would have been denied them before the plague. These were exceptions rather than the rule, but they demonstrated possibilities that would be more fully realized in later centuries. The plague's impact on gender relations extended beyond economics and labor. The social disruptions created by the plague loosened some traditional constraints. Arranged marriages became somewhat less rigid when families were scrambling to secure alliances in a reduced population. Young people sometimes had more say in choosing their spouses, though parental authority remained strong. The cultural representation of women in post-plague art and literature showed some evolution. While medieval misogyny certainly persisted, There was also increased recognition of women's capabilities and contributions. The literature of the late 14th and early 15th centuries sometimes featured strong female characters who showed intelligence, courage, and agency. This may have reflected the real-world experiences of women during the crisis. The plague's influence on childhood and child-rearing practices was significant. With high mortality, children were precious. But medieval society still maintained fairly harsh approaches to child discipline and education. The post-plague period saw some softening, though this was gradual and uneven. Parents who had lost children to plague sometimes became more protective of surviving children, though others became fatalistic about child mortality. Education for children expanded somewhat in the post-plague period. With guilds needing to recruit members and maintain skills, apprenticeship became more accessible to boys from modest backgrounds. Girls' education remained mostly focused on domestic skills, but merchant families sometimes ensured their daughters could read and calculate, skills useful for helping with family businesses. Orphanages and charitable institutions for children expanded after the plague. Many children had lost parents, and communities had to care for them. Religious institutions, guilds, and municipalities established orphanages and schools. While conditions in these institutions were often harsh by modern standards, they represented attempts to address the social crisis created by so many orphan children. The legacy of the Black Death shaped how later generations understood and responded to subsequent plague outbreaks. When plague returned in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, people remembered the catastrophe of the 14th century. This memory influenced responses, sometimes leading to panic and overreaction, other times to organized public health measures. Cities that had developed plague regulations during the Black Death applied them to later outbreaks. Venice's quarantine system became a model for other cities. Milan's aggressive approach, including boarding up houses with plague victims inside, was replicated elsewhere despite its cruelty. These measures, developed through bitter experience, became standard tools in the fight against plague. The medical understanding of plague advanced slowly through repeated outbreaks. Each epidemic provided more observations and data. Physicians noticed patterns. Connection between plague and fleas or rats was sometimes observed, though not fully understood. The link between filth and disease became more accepted, leading to improved sanitation practices in some cities. The development of plague hospitals, or pest houses, was another legacy of the Black Death. These institutions, specifically for isolating and treating plague victims, became common in European cities. While treatment remained ineffective until the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, isolation did help slow the spread of plague in some cases. The pest house was an ancestor of the specialized infectious disease hospitals that exist today. The psychological impact of repeated plague outbreaks, building on the trauma of the Black Death, created a culture of anxiety about disease. Every fever, every swelling, every outbreak of illness raised fears of a new plague. This anxiety influenced daily life, religious practices, and social interactions. The fear of plague became embedded in European culture. This fear also drove scientific inquiry. The desire to understand and prevent plague motivated research into disease causation. While effective treatments and preventions were not found until the modern era, the questioning and investigation spurred by plague contributed to the gradual development of scientific medicine. Plague was a motivator for medical progress, even as it killed millions. The economic consequences of the Black Death continued to shape Europe for centuries. The labor shortages that initially drove up wages gradually resolved as population recovered, but the structural changes to the economy persisted. Serfdom, weakened by the plague, continued its decline. By the 16th century, serfdom had largely disappeared from Western Europe, though it persisted and even intensified in Eastern Europe. The commercial capitalism that the plague helped accelerate transformed the European economy. The importance of trade, banking, and manufacturing increased relative to agriculture. Cities grew in power and wealth. The merchant class became more influential, challenging the traditional dominance of the nobility and clergy. This economic transformation was one of the key developments that created modern Europe. The impact on global trade patterns had far-reaching consequences. The search for new trade routes to Asia, partly motivated by the disruption of Silk Road trade during the plague years, led to European exploration and eventual colonization of the Americas. This had catastrophic consequences for indigenous American populations, who would face their own demographic collapse when European diseases, including plague, arrived in the New World. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and New World after 1492, can be traced in part to economic and political developments rooted in the post-Black Death era. The European powers that colonized the Americas were shaped by their experiences with the plague and its aftermath. The aggressive, expansionist Europe that emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries was partly a product of the transformation wrought by the Black Death. The influence of the plague on political theory and governance extended into the early modern period. The concept of the modern state, with its centralized authority and claim to monopoly on legitimate violence, developed partly in response to the need for coordinated responses to crises like plague. The public health powers that states claimed, the right to quarantine, to regulate movement, to control trade, these were expansions of state authority that had roots in plague responses. The social contract theories that developed in the 17th and 18th centuries, though focused on different issues, existed in a context shaped by the plague. The relationship between individuals and the state, between rights and duties, between liberty and security, these fundamental political questions had been raised in new forms by the plague. When quarantines prevented people from working or authorities isolated entire neighborhoods, questions about the limits of legitimate state power became urgent and practical. The development of statistics and probability theory, which began in the 16th and 17th centuries, was partly motivated by the need to understand and predict disease outbreaks. Bills of mortality, early statistical records of deaths, were compiled in plague years to track the disease's progress. These records, though crude, were ancestors of modern epidemiological surveillance. The desire to quantify plague risk contributed to the mathematical formalization of probability. Insurance, as mentioned before, developed partly in response to plague and other catastrophic risks. The calculation of premiums, the pooling of risk, the concept of actuarial science, all these had roots in attempts to manage the economic uncertainty created by plague and other disasters. The financial instruments and institutions developed to deal with plague risk became part of the infrastructure of modern capitalism. The architectural legacy of the plague, while less obvious than literary or artistic legacies, is nonetheless significant. Churches built or modified in the late 14th and 15th centuries often include features reflecting plague concerns. Larger windows for better ventilation, more spacious designs to reduce crowding, outdoor preaching spaces for use during epidemics, these practical considerations influence church architecture. Hospitals and charitable institutions built in the post-plague period incorporated lessons from the epidemic. More attention to sanitation, separate wards for different types of patients, better ventilation, these design features gradually became standard. The evolution of hospital architecture from medieval great halls where all patients were together toward more specialized and hygienic facilities owed something to plague experience. Urban planning, such as it existed in medieval and early modern Europe, also bore traces of plague concerns. Wider streets to reduce crowding, regulations about waste disposal, controls on slaughterhouses and other noxious trades, these measures were often justified by concerns about plague. While many cities remained crowded and unsanitary by modern standards, the idea that urban design could influence public health gained ground in the post-plague era. The fortification architecture of the late medieval period was influenced indirectly by the plague. The need to control access to cities, to establish quarantine stations at gates, to monitor who entered and left, all these concerns were reflected in the design of city defenses. Gates became more elaborate checkpoints. Walls incorporated spaces for quarantine and inspection of travelers and goods. The social welfare systems that developed in the late medieval and early modern periods owed much to the plague experience. The massive scale of need created by the plague, with so many orphans, widows, and impoverished survivors, necessitated organized responses. Municipal governments, churches, guilds, and charitable organizations all expanded their welfare activities. The concept of poor relief, the idea that society has a responsibility to help those unable to support themselves, gained strength in the post-plague period. Before the plague, charity was primarily individual and religious. After the plague, it became more organized and systematic. The development of poor laws in England and similar legislation elsewhere had roots in the social crisis created by the Black Death. Hospitals for the poor and sick expanded after the plague. These institutions, though often inadequate by modern standards, represented societal recognition that caring for the sick was a collective responsibility. The hospital systems that exist in European countries today have complex origins, but the medieval hospitals founded or expanded in response to plague were important predecessors. Education and literacy expanded in the late medieval period partly due to plague-related social changes. The disruption of clerical education created demand for literate laypeople. Merchants needed clerks who could read and write. Governments needed administrators. The expansion of education to meet these needs increased literacy rates and created a more educated populace. The invention of printing in the mid-15th century amplified this trend. Printed books made education more accessible. The availability of texts in vernacular languages rather than just Latin democratized learning. The intellectual flowering of the Renaissance and the religious ferment of the Reformation were both facilitated by printing, which emerged in a Europe transformed by the plague. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries occurred in a world shaped by the plague. The questioning attitude toward traditional authority, the emphasis on observation and experiment, the willingness to challenge established doctrines, all these characteristics of early modern science may have been influenced by the plague's demonstration of the limits of traditional learning. When physicians and theologians could neither explain nor prevent catastrophe, their authority was implicitly questioned. The development of modern medicine was particularly influenced by plague. The failures of medieval medicine during the Black Death eventually motivated searches for better approaches. Anatomical study, rejected or restricted in the medieval period, gained acceptance as physicians sought to understand the body better. The emphasis on clinical observation, on carefully noting symptoms and outcomes, grew from the urgent practical need to deal with disease. The germ theory of disease, which would not be fully developed until the 19th century, had some of its conceptual roots in plague observations. The recognition that disease could spread from person to person, that contagion was real, was reinforced by plague experience. While medieval physicians did not understand microorganisms, they did observe that close contact with plague victims led to infection. This empirical observation laid groundwork for later theoretical understanding. Public health as a distinct field and governmental responsibility emerged from plague responses. The idea that authorities should take measures to prevent disease, not just care for the sick, gained acceptance in plague years. Quarantine, sanitation regulations, monitoring of disease outbreaks, these practices became established parts of governmental activity. Modern public health institutions and practices descend from this medieval and early modern heritage. The development of epidemiology, the study of disease patterns in populations, also has roots in plague experience. The tracking of plague cases, the mapping of outbreaks, the observation of patterns in who got sick and who did not, all these were early forms of epidemiological investigation. The bills of mortality kept during London plague outbreaks in the 16th and 17th centuries were analysed by John Graunt in the 17th century, producing one of the first statistical studies of disease. This work helped establish epidemiology as a quantitative science. The ethical frameworks for medical care and research were influenced by plague experiences. The duties of physicians, whether they should stay and care for patients at risk to their own lives or could legitimately flee, were debated during plague years. These debates contributed to the development of medical ethics as a field. The modern principle that healthcare providers have special obligations to care for the sick, even at personal risk, has roots in these medieval and early modern discussions. Research ethics, particularly regarding experimentation on human subjects, also has connections to plague. During desperate outbreaks, various untested treatments were tried on plague victims. Sometimes these experiments were done without consent, raising ethical concerns even in that era. The evolution toward modern standards of informed consent and ethical review of human subjects research occurred over centuries, but plague experiences were part of that evolution. The psychological sciences, which would not develop as formal disciplines until the 19th and 20th centuries, nonetheless have some conceptual debts to plague observations. The recognition that severe stress and trauma could affect mental health, that collective disasters could create shared psychological responses, that fear and anxiety could influence behavior, all these insights were available in inchoate form from plague experience. The medieval understanding of these phenomena was not scientific, but the observations and experiences existed and would eventually inform systematic study. The sociology of disaster, how societies respond to catastrophe, also has roots in plague experience. Observers noted how social structures broke down or transformed under pressure. They saw how some communities came together while others fractured. They observed scapegoating, panic, heroism, and adaptation. These observations, recorded in chronicles and other sources, are early examples of disaster sociology, even though the formal discipline would not emerge until much later. The anthropology of death and dying, how different cultures understand and ritualize death, was deeply affected by the plague. The normal funeral rites that helped people process grief and honor the dead could not be maintained when deaths were so numerous. New practices emerged, some temporary and others lasting. The cultural history of death in European societies changed during the plague years, with effects that persisted for centuries. The concept of memorialization, how societies remember and honor the dead, was tested and transformed by the plague. The sheer number of dead made individual commemoration difficult. Mass graves and collective memorials became necessary. The ways that post-plague societies remembered their dead influenced later practices of collective commemoration, from war memorials to monuments to other disasters. The religious concept of purgatory and prayers for the dead gained new importance after the plague. With so many dead, often without proper last rites, concern for their souls intensified. The expansion of chantry chapels, where masses were said for the dead, and the proliferation of indulgences, papal pardons that reduced time in purgatory, were partly responses to plague anxiety about the fate of the dead. These practices, in turn, contributed to the religious controversies that led to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's critique of indulgences, which sparked the Reformation in 1517, occurred in a context where concerns about the dead and purgatory had been heightened by centuries of plague. While the Reformation had many causes, the religious anxieties created or amplified by plague were part of the cultural and psychological background. The plague had made questions about sin, death, and salvation urgently personal for millions of people. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Church's response to Protestantism, also occurred in a post-plague context. The reforms instituted by the Council of Trent, the emphasis on education and pastoral care, the founding of new religious orders like the Jesuits, all these were efforts to revitalize the Church after a period of crisis that included but was not limited to plague. The plague had exposed weaknesses in the Church's spiritual and organizational structures, and the Counter-Reformation addressed these, though often in ways the reformers had not anticipated. The wars of religion that convulsed Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries occurred in a world still experiencing periodic plague outbreaks. Plague killed indiscriminately during these conflicts, sometimes more effectively than the combatants. The interplay between war, famine, and plague created repeated catastrophes. The 30 Years' War, which devastated much of Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, saw plague outbreaks that killed as many as or more than the fighting itself. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War and established principles of state sovereignty and religious toleration, was negotiated partly out of exhaustion from decades of combined war and plague. The diplomats at Westphalia were working to create a more stable order after generations of chaos. The religious and political system they established shaped Europe for centuries, and it was forged partly in response to the combined traumas of war and disease. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, with its emphasis on reason, progress, and science, was a reaction against the superstition and disorder of previous centuries. Enlightenment thinkers looked back on the medieval period, including the plague years, as times of darkness and ignorance. They believed that reason and science could prevent such catastrophes in the future. This optimism was partly justified, as public health and medicine did improve. But it also represented a misunderstanding of the past and an overconfidence in progress that would be challenged by future disasters. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries occurred in a Europe that had been fundamentally reshaped by the Black Death and its aftermath. The economic structures, social relationships, political systems, and cultural attitudes that made industrialization possible had deep roots in the post-plague transformation of European society. This is not to say that the plague caused the Industrial Revolution, but rather that the path from medieval to modern Europe passed through the plague years, and the journey was transformed by that passage. The public health challenges of industrialization, the crowded cities, the poor sanitation, the spread of diseases like cholera and typhus, echoed in some ways the plague experience. The public health reforms of the 19th century, including the sanitary movement and the development of modern sewage and water systems, drew on centuries of accumulated experience with epidemic disease. The institutional and conceptual tools used to address 19th century urban health crises had roots reaching back to the plague. The cholera pandemics of the 19th century revived fears and responses reminiscent of plague. Quarantines were imposed, scapegoating occurred, misinformation spread, and authorities struggled to respond effectively. But the 19th century also saw new approaches. The development of epidemiology as a science, exemplified by John Snow's investigation of cholera in London in 1854, represented an advance over medieval responses to plague. Yet the continuities were also striking, showing how plague experience had shaped European approaches to epidemic disease. The development of microbiology and germ theory in the late 19th century finally provided a scientific explanation for diseases like plague. Alexandre Yerson's discovery of the plague bacterium in 1894 completed a journey of understanding that had begun in the Black Death. The medieval physicians who struggled to explain plague could not have imagined bacteria, but their observations and questions contributed to the long process that eventually led to modern microbiology. The development of antibiotics in the 20th century finally provided effective treatment for plague. Streptomycin and other antibiotics, discovered in the 1940s, could cure plague if administered promptly. This represented a fundamental shift from all previous human experience with the disease. For the first time in history, plague was not a death sentence. This medical triumph was one of the great achievements of 20th century science, ending plague's reign as one of humanity's most feared diseases. Yet plague has not been eliminated. It still exists in wild rodent populations in many parts of the world, including the western United States, parts of Asia, and Africa. Small numbers of human cases occur each year, usually from contact with infected animals. Most cases today can be cured with antibiotics, but if left untreated, plague is still lethal. The disease that devastated medieval Europe remains a reality in the 21st century, though vastly diminished in impact. The potential for plague to re-emerge as a major threat exists. Antibiotic-resistant strains of Yersinia pestis have been identified. If such strains became widespread, treating plague would become much more difficult. The possibility of plague being used as a biological weapon has been considered by military planners and biodefense experts. The bacterium's lethality and ability to spread make it a potential threat even in the modern world. The historical legacy of the Black Death is vast. It killed perhaps 30 to 60% of Europe's population, fundamentally reshaping medieval society. It accelerated the decline of feudalism. It contributed to religious, cultural, and intellectual changes. It created economic disruptions and opportunities. It traumatized European society in ways that echoed for centuries. Many historians consider the Black Death a turning point in European history. The medieval world that existed before the plague was different from the world that emerged afterward. The late medieval and early Renaissance periods bore the marks of the plague's devastation and the transformations it triggered. The Renaissance itself may have been influenced by the social and economic changes the plague caused, though this remains debated. The Black Death also demonstrated the interconnectedness of Eurasian societies. The disease traveled the trade routes linking East and West, showing that medieval Eurasia was not a collection of isolated regions but a network of connected societies. This connectivity, which allowed plague to spread so rapidly, was both a strength and a vulnerability of medieval civilization. The plague's legacy extends to modern times. Public health systems, epidemiology, the understanding of infectious disease, all have roots partly in responses to plague. The concept of quarantine, though imperfectly understood in the 14th century, proved valuable and continues today. Modern disease control measures echo those first developed in response to plague. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, comparisons to historical pandemics, especially the Black Death, were common. While COVID-19 was nowhere near as deadly proportionally as the Black Death, The experience of pandemic, lockdowns, social disruption, economic upheaval echoed aspects of the medieval experience. These comparisons helped people understand what they were experiencing and placed it in historical context. The Black Death reminds us of human vulnerability to disease, but also of human resilience. Medieval people faced an incomprehensible catastrophe with primitive medicine and limited understanding. Yet they survived. They rebuilt. They adapted. In the generations after the plague, European civilization not only recovered but in many ways flourished, entering the Renaissance and the early modern period. The stories of those who lived through the Black Death, their suffering and courage, their fear and hope, deserve to be remembered. The merchants who continued trading despite the risks. The physicians who treated patients knowing they would probably die. The clergy who ministered to the sick. The parents who tried to protect their children. The survivors who carried on and rebuilt their shattered world. All of these people, mostly anonymous now, contributed to humanity's survival of its greatest catastrophe. As we conclude our journey through the shadow of the Black Death, we return to our own time with a deeper understanding of how fragile and resilient human society can be. The plague that killed tens of millions in the 14th century shaped the world we inherited. Its effects rippled down through the centuries, visible in our institutions, our cultures, our collective memory. If you found this exploration meaningful, if it helped you reflect on history, mortality, and human endurance, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think about those medieval people who faced darkness and somehow found light, who experienced unimaginable loss and yet created a future for us to inherit. Their story is part of our story, a reminder that humanity has faced and survived crisis before and will again. Rest well, and thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters.